The cold hit me first, not the bone-deep chill of a January night, but the icy tendril of dread that snaked around my spine. It was the same cold I'd felt before, a premonition of violation, a silent scream hanging in the air. The door to our dorm room was ajar, not just unlocked, but slightly open, a dark maw in the brightly lit hallway. My hand instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the worn metal of my analog watch. A useless tick, a futile attempt to ground myself when the world was clearly coming undone. The room inside was a disaster, a furious, desperate scramble. Textbooks lay scattered, pages ripped. My cheap suitcase had been upended, clothes strewn like disemboweled guts. Every drawer was pulled out, every flimsy shelf emptied. But amidst the chaos, one thing stood out in its absence. The small, tarnished green metal box, the one I'd found buried beneath phantom trees, the one containing the coded pages that were my last, fragile link to a past that was actively being erased. It was gone, vanished, like everything else connected to Casey Falls. The air felt thin, metallic, tasting of ozone and violated space. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between a gasp and a guttural curse. They knew, whatever they were. They knew, and they had found me. They say every story has a beginning. Mine began not with a bang, but with a whisper of absence, a slow, creeping rot of reality. Long before my sanctuary was ripped open like a cheap parcel. But the end of one nightmare often signals the true start of another, and the missing pages were just the final act in the vanishing trick of Casey Falls. The final nail in the coffin of the only life I had ever known. It started subtly enough, as these things always do. Not with a monster under the bed or a spectral whisper in the dark, but with the mundane, soul-crushing bureaucracy of an Amtrak station. It was the tail end of my first semester at some nondescript Michigan university, a place I'd chosen for its distance from, well, from everything. I'd walked past the station 100 times, the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner clinging to the air, the rhythmic clack of the arrival mush departure board a dull comfort. Now, standing at the ticket counter, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like a dying insect, I felt a familiar, creeping unease. I was wearing my old, worn leather jacket, the one that had seen me through more than its fair share of cheap diner meals and colder-than-hell nights. It was a second skin, a threadbare shield against a world that rarely made sense. One ticket to Casey Falls, Michigan. Please, I said, my voice perhaps a little too casual, as if I weren't asking for passage to a place that, even then, felt like a memory already blurring at the edges. The attendant, a woman whose face suggested she'd seen more than her share of lunatics, looked up from her screen, her eyes blinking slowly, like a malfunctioning automaton. Where? Her voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, just a simple query for clarification. Casey Falls, Michigan, I repeated, a smidge slower, a tiny flicker of irritation beginning to spark. It wasn't a trick question. It was my hometown, the place I'd lived for 18 years, or had I? A tiny, cold knot formed in my stomach. She typed, her fingers moving with the hesitant slowness of someone searching a database for an obscure item. Her brow furrowed, a silent admission of defeat. She glanced at me, then gestured vaguely towards a glass-walled office. Just a moment, sir. A manager, looking equally tired, emerged. A hushed consultation, a few more clicks, more head shakes. Sir, the manager finally announced, his voice oozing professional politeness. We have no record of a Casey Falls, Michigan. It's not a stop on any of our lines. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. How can that be? I heard my own voice, higher pitched than usual, betraying the rising panic. I can see the station, Berry Street, just east of it. Every spring break, my family and I took the train into Chicago. 7 in the morning. My dad would give me $2 for a Coke and pretzels. My sister Janie and I, We'd sit on those hard benches, waiting. The memory was crystal clear, sharper than the faces of the bewildered attendants before me. The smell of the train exhaust, the distant rumble, Janie's impatient fidgeting beside me. But even as I spoke, a sliver of that memory seemed to fray, a thread loosening from the tapestry. It was there, tangible, yet somehow unreachable. I tried to explain, to plead, to make them understand, but their system was an unyielding god, and its holy writ contained no mention of Casey Falls. They offered alternatives, other towns, nearby cities, as if close enough was an acceptable substitute for a place that was demonstrably there. My world-weary cynicism, usually a comforting blanket, felt threadbare and useless. This wasn't the kind of absurdity I could simply scoff at and walk away from. This was a direct assault on my reality, a subtle, insidious violation. The kind of thing that reminded me of that deep-seated, half-forgotten trauma from my childhood. A house consumed by fire, a memory deliberately locked away behind a wall of amnesia. This felt like the smoke from that fire, seeping under the cracks of that mental barrier. I spent that Christmas alone in my dorm room, the silence amplified by the sudden, stark absence of everything I'd known. The holiday decorations in the campus quad felt like a cruel joke, twinkling lights mocking the growing darkness inside me. My phone became a hot brick in my hand, desperately trying to bridge the chasm that had opened between me and my family. Mom, Dad, Janie. I called every number, sent every email, every text. Nothing. The digital void swallowed my messages. Even stranger, and far more terrifying, was their sudden, total disappearance from the online world. Social media profiles, gone. Email addresses, bounced. It was as if they had been expunged from the internet, scrubbed clean, leaving no trace. When I called their home number, a dispassionate recording informed me that the number I was trying to reach had been disconnected. My stomach churned, a cold dread coiling in my gut. This wasn't just a missed call, it was an erasure, a professional, thorough erasure. What the hell was going on? My typical sarcastic internal monologue was drowned out by a rising tide of panic. My default setting was fatalism, a resigned acceptance of the universe's inherent cruelty. But this felt different. This wasn't just bad luck. It was active, malicious. The next 2 weeks, ordinarily a blur of forced family cheer, reconnection with high school acquaintances, or, more likely, avoiding them, and a general sense of being young and unburdened, were instead consumed by a frantic, obsessive investigation. I became a digital archaeologist, sifting through the internet's endless strata for any mention, any whisper, any ghost of my hometown. Google, Yahoo, even Bing, the forgotten backwater of search engines, yielded nothing. Not a single photograph, not a forum post, not a local news article, no mention of the central Michigan burg, purportedly ensconced in dense forest, home to the now-defunct Casey Falls Army Training Camp and its collapsed copper mines. I remembered the red brick of the old barracks, the overgrown trails near the mine entrances where we used to dare each other to explore. All of it, gone. Even Google Maps, the digital atlas of our modern world, had no record. Where a cluster of homes and farms and a vibrant main street should have been, there was only an uninterrupted, verdant expanse of forest land. My hometown had literally been wiped off the map. A part of me, the deeply cynical part, almost admired the efficiency of it. Worse yet, and this was the true horror, it was beginning to disappear from my own memory. It was insidious, like a virus corrupting a hard drive, erasing files bit by bit. As Christmas break wore on, and my ceaseless digital excavation failed to yield a shred of evidence of Casey Falls' existence, I noticed my own recollection of it fading. The details, once so vivid, became fuzzy. The faces of my classmates, the specific smell of the high school cafeteria, the way the light hit the old oak tree outside my bedroom window. It all blurred, dissolving into a generic, indistinct background. One New Year's Eve, I found myself staring bleary-eyed at the television screen in the quiet, echoing dorm, watching the revelers crowd Times Square, a cascade of glitter and forced joy, waiting for the spangled ball to drop. And then it hit me, a sickening lurch in my gut that transcended mere nausea. I couldn't remember any previous New Year's Eve. How had I spent them in Casey Falls? Had we gone to a party? Watched fireworks? Had my parents made a special dinner? The void where those memories should have been was gaping, a cold, dark pit. It was common, I knew, for mundane memories to bleed into one another, for the specific details of a party or a family gathering to merge and blur over time. But to lose every single New Year's Eve from one's personal history, that was not normal. That was a surgical excision. I felt hollowed out, a visceral sense of emptiness in the space where Casey Falls and the preceding 18 years of my memories should have been. And in that void, I could feel it, a chilling certainty. Something dark, something malevolent, something utterly sinister lurked. It felt like the lingering echo of that long-ago fire, the one that had stolen my past once before. I was marked. I'd always known it, and now whatever had marked me was coming to collect. When my roommate, Sean, finally returned in January, smelling faintly of cheap beer and home-cooked meals, he found me a spectral figure, pale and gaunt, having been holed up in our dorm for the entire break. He took one look at my bloodshot eyes and the empty instant noodle cups stacked precariously on my desk, and naturally inquired what in the hell had happened. What happened indeed? I snarled, the words escaping my lips with a wild, desperate edge I barely recognized as my own. My cynicism, usually reserved for the incompetence of authority figures or the general idiocy of humanity, was now turning inwards, burning at the edges of my sanity, desperate for any sliver of an external memory, even if secondhand. I interrogated Sean. "Surely you remember me talking about home at some point, right?" I asked, my voice thick with a raw need. "We must have. All those two, chats, the ones fueled by cheap coffee and existential dread. You must remember something." Sean shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room, settling on the chaotic mess that was my half of the dorm. He was a decent kid, if a bit bland, and clearly out of his depth. He agreed that, surely in our various late-night ramblings, we must have touched on the subject of our respective origins. But he was chagrined to admit that nothing specific returned to him. No town names, no family anecdotes, nothing that anchored me to a place or a past. Just me, floating, detached. The silver lining, if one could call it that, to this deeply distressing conversation was that I now had a partner, however reluctant. Sean, a curious if somewhat naive soul, was fascinated by my absent origin. He caught up quickly, performing his own research online, clicking through the same dead links and empty map coordinates I had, before arriving at the only logical, terrifying conclusion: we had to see for ourselves. His initial amusement had curdled into genuine concern, or at least a morbid curiosity. My reluctant conscience, usually the thing dragging me into trouble, was screaming at me to run, to let this go, to accept the comfortable lie. But the more the universe tried to erase Casey Falls, the more I felt an inexplicable, desperate pull to find it. This was my history, my family. If I lost this, what was left? The thought of that childhood fire, the burning house, the searing, forgotten truth, festered in the back of my mind. So, on a bleak weekend in late January, Sean drove us in his junky, rattling sedan into the very heart of the Mitten, as Michiganders called their lower peninsula. The journey was long, punctuated by the monotonous drone of the engine and the growing silence between us. Every mile closer felt heavier, the air thicker. My hand went to my watch repeatedly, a frantic, unconscious gesture. The destination, where Casey Falls should have carved out a space for itself from the surrounding forest. A place I could almost taste on my tongue, a scent in the phantom breeze. To my mounting horror, we found only trees, a sea of skeletal, winter-bare oaks and maples, stretching endlessly under a sky the color of old tin. There was no main street, no familiar storefronts, no welcome sign, no dilapidated town hall, nothing. Where Main Street should have intersected with Blanchard Road, where the old general store used to stand, there was only a dirt drive, barely a path, reaching back into the dense, silent woods. The air here was different, too. Not just cold, but empty. A silence that hummed with a profound absence. A vacuum where noise should have been. Sean idled the car, his face a mask of disbelief. He didn't think his rust bucket sedan would handle the uneven, mud-slicked road too well. "Leo, are you sure?" His voice was hesitant, laced with a fear that echoed my own. But after some pleading, some desperate insistence on my part, he acquiesced. He always did, eventually. My reluctant conscience, I realized, was also a relentless one. We drove slow, the car bouncing over unseen roots and rocks, the skeletal tree branches squeezing us into a claustrophobic tunnel of foliage. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every rustle of dead leaves sounded like a whispered secret. The forest felt wrong, not just wild, but unnatural. Too quiet, too perfect in its emptiness, like a wound that had healed over, leaving a scar where something vital had been ripped out. "Right here," I said, my voice cracking, a desperate plea to the universe. Casey Falls should be right here. The old general store, the post office, the diner. It all should be right here. I pointed frantically at a particularly dense thicket of pines, trying to conjure the image. To force reality to bend to my will, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the eerie perfection of the forest where my life should have been. It was too much. I leapt out of the car without a word, slamming the door behind me. I raced through the woods, my movements fueled by a volatile cocktail of anger, grief, confusion, and a bone-deep fear that something truly monstrous had happened here. It wasn't rational. It was pure, unadulterated emotion propelling me through the underbrush, twigs snapping under my worn boots, branches clawing at my jacket. My breath hitched in my throat, each gasping inhale burning my lungs. I ran until my legs ached, until my vision blurred, until I finally tripped over something metal, something jarringly man-made in this primordial wilderness. I scrambled to my knees, turning back to find it, a small green box, like a military-issue ammunition can or a geocache, resting half-buried on the forest floor. It was mud-splattered, blending almost perfectly with the decaying leaves and pine needles. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and dread. This was it. This had to be it. I reached out a trembling hand and carefully unlatched the rusty clasp. Inside, nestled amongst a few desiccated leaves, were pages yellowed with age, brittle and thin, covered in some sort of code scrawled across them. The penmanship was only half decent, a mix of hurried strokes and deliberate, strange symbols. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it was organized, deliberate. It was a message. My fingers brushed against the rough paper, a tangible link to something. "What the hell is that?" Sean's voice startled me, cutting through the eerie silence of the woods. He had finally caught up, panting slightly, his face pale beneath the weak winter light. He looked at the box, then at the strange script, his expression a mixture of confusion and burgeoning fear. It was the question we tried desperately to pair with an answer over the ensuing month. Neither of us were real code breakers. I'd dabbled in logic puzzles, but this was beyond anything I'd encountered. We carefully photographed the pages, then shopped them around campus, taking them to math nerds with their thick glasses and even braver professors in the hopes that one of them might crack it. They were fascinated, intrigued, some even obsessed for a few days. One by one, they tried their best to decipher the documents, their initial enthusiasm slowly eroding into frustrated resignation. Each one met invariably with defeat. One linguistics professor, a stern woman with a perpetually unimpressed expression, called it the toughest code she'd ever encountered, a masterpiece of obfuscation. Another suggested, with an air of weary academic authority, that in all likelihood the pages were simply rubbish, a random collection of scribbles, a cruel joke. But the fact that I'd found it precisely where my hometown should have been, a digital void filled by a physical artifact, kept me from accepting the latter explanation. The universe had tried to erase Casey Falls. It had tried to erase my memories. But this strange coded text was a defiance. Something was written in those pages. I knew it with a chilling certainty. Something that held the secret. Something that helped explain what had happened to Casey Falls. I spent hours staring at the symbols, trying to find a pattern, a key, anything that might unlock the truth. My old analog watch was constantly fiddled with, a grounding point against the rising tide of paranoia. I even started sketching the symbols, trying to internalize them, to find a hidden meaning, a new habit born of desperation and the strange, unsettling beauty of the unknown. But I'll never uncover its secrets, because on March 3rd, someone tore our dorm room apart. Not just rifled through it, but systematically, violently ransacked it, and the only thing they took with them was the coded pages, the green metal box a minor casualty left behind. It was a message, brutally delivered. Stop looking. Spooked beyond anything I'd ever seen him. Sean told me he would pursue the Casey Falls mystery no further. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. He believed that by showing the documents around campus, by asking too many questions, we'd attracted the attention of the feds, CIA, NSA, some other shadowy three-letter agency no one had ever heard of, or perhaps something far worse, something with no letters at all. Now, he was convinced we were being watched, and he was right. I could feel it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the weight of unseen eyes, a familiar feeling that spoke of a deep, ancient curse. It was the same feeling that had stalked me from my earliest, forgotten memories. The reason my childhood home had burned to the ground. "Whatever happened to your hometown, Leo?" Sean said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "They don't want anyone to find out." He barely looked at me as he spoke, as if even acknowledging my existence would put him in further danger. The next week, Sean transferred out. He didn't say goodbye. No ceremony, no parting words, just a hastily packed car and a note stuck to the dorm door from the registrar. Another exit without explanation. Another person gone from my life. Another ghost added to my personal ledger. He was smart to run. I knew that. But something in me, that stubborn, self-destructive spark of reluctant conscience, refused to let it go. I've since taken a barista job to be able to stay in Chicago through the summer, pulling bitter espressos and forcing thin smiles for strangers. I had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no home, no past, reckoning with the fact I've become an orphan in every sense of the word. I can't help shaking the feeling that someone is watching me. Not just the physical sensation of eyes, but a deeper, more profound awareness, as if the very air around me is charged with a quiet, persistent malevolence. Whatever happened to Casey Falls, it wasn't good. I can feel it in my bones, the unheard screams of family and neighbors vibrating in the marrow, a low hum beneath my skin, a constant echo of a trauma that stretches back further than even Casey Falls, to that long-ago fire, that forgotten house. I feel them, those lost soul, and it makes me sick, a churning nausea that never fully recedes. But I cling to the horror, the dread, the sickness, because it's all I have left. It's the last twisted thread connecting me to the world that was. And I know, with a chilling certainty that makes my watch hand tremble, that this is just the beginning. The world is far bigger and far more terrifying than I ever imagined. And it has its eye on me. Total character count 9,878. The slick, wet sound of tearing flesh wasn't what got me, nor was it the guttural, hungry growl that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath my feet. It was the way Luke's legs, clad in faded denim, kicked frantically, impossibly, for one last, desperate moment before they too vanished into the maw of what had once been Miss Jacobs. My own body was pinned, an invisible vice crushing me against the wall, forcing my eyes open, scorching the image onto the back of my eyelids where it would forever replay, a silent film of absolute, unvarnished horror. There was no scream left in me, just a thin, reedy whimper caught in a throat that felt like it had been stuffed with sawdust and rusty nails. My mind, already a fragile thing even back then, felt the strain, 1,000 tiny fractures spiderwebbing across its surface, threatening to shatter completely. The air, thick with the stench of something ancient and foul, suddenly cracked with a report like a thunderclap, and for a blessed, fleeting second, the monstrous visage focused on me wavered. That was how it ended, not with a whimper, but with a tearing, wet sound that would echo in my nightmares for decades. But to understand how we got there, how a couple of wide-eyed kids stumbled into a den of primordial evil, you have to go back to a simpler time, a time when the monster still wore human skin, at least for a while, and the world hadn't quite torn itself open at the seams for me yet, back when I was just Ricky, and my biggest problem was what kind of candy to spend my hard-earned detective money on. It's funny, the things you remember. Most of my childhood is a blurry mess, a vast, empty canyon that echoes with forgotten names and faces. There's a specific kind of amnesia that comes from trauma, a brain's desperate attempt to protect itself by sealing off the worst of it. But some things, some moments, cut through that fog like a butcher's knife, leaving deep, ragged scars that never quite heal. The summer I turned 10 was one of those moments. That was the summer Luke and I decided to become the Brook Street Sleuths. Luke was my best friend, all elbows and knees, with an imagination that could conjure entire worlds out of thin air. He was the architect of our grand detective scheme, inspired by the gritty private eye shows we'd sneak watch on his dad's old black and white TV. We lived on Brook Street, a quiet, tree-lined artery in a town so small it practically disappeared if you blinked too hard in the Oregonian mist. Calling ourselves the Brook Street Sleuths felt important, professional. It gave a certain weight to our adventures, a veneer of seriousness over what was, essentially, just two kids looking for an excuse to eat more candy. Our headquarters was Luke's treehouse, a rickety perch overlooking his backyard, where the only thing truly mysterious was how it managed to stay upright after a good gust of wind. We drafted our advertisement on a crumpled piece of notebook paper, our combined handwriting a testament to enthusiasm over penmanship. The Brook Street Sleuths, no mystery too small, inquire at Elmer's Market. We even offered a discount for chipmunk-related cases, which, as it turned out, was surprisingly good for business. Mr. Elmer, a man whose face was a roadmap of kindly wrinkles, let us pin our masterpiece to the community board for free, a gesture of small-town generosity that felt like a major victory to us. Looking back, I wonder if he just found our earnestness amusing, or if he saw the nascent hunger for purpose, however misguided, in our young eyes. Probably both. For a month or so, that summer, we were on top of the world. Our caseload was, admittedly, less hard-boiled detective and more lightly poached suburban curiosity. Who's been taking the blackberries from Miss Jacobs' brambles? We solved that one with the kind of diligent surveillance usually reserved for international espionage. Turns out, it was almost everyone who passed by. And, true to our chipmunk discount, a literal army of the little furred bandits. What made the small hole in the Lowry's front yard? Another chipmunk. Of course, the town, as I recall, was practically overflowing with the chittering rodents. They were the bane of gardeners and the unwitting catalyst for our burgeoning detective careers. But not all our cases involved the critters. Some were slightly more complex, like the mystery of the missing garden gnome, which turned up in Old Man Henderson's bird bath, wearing a tiny pair of sunglasses. To the adults who hired us, these weren't really mysteries. They were just excuses to give two bored kids a sense of purpose, a bit of pocket money, and a steady supply of sodas and candy bars. They played along, and God bless them, nodding sagely as we presented our groundbreaking findings, praising our sleuthing skills. It was the best thing about living in a community like that, the willingness of neighbors to foster a child's imagination, even if it meant pretending a missing garden gnome was a high-stakes felony. I remember thinking, back then, that this was how life worked. Little problems, easily solved, with a sweet reward at the end. I had no idea that some mysteries didn't have answers, only consequences. The Brook Street sleuths, despite our impressive, to us, success rate, was a short-lived agency. Our final case, the one that burned the innocence right out of us, began with a very real, very chilling question. Where is Mr. Page's dog? Frank Page was my next-door neighbor, a retired widower whose house always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. His companion was Milo, a Yorkie with the energy of a small, yappy tornado. Frank, in his gruff but affectionate way, often referred to Milo as a pain in the proverbial. And it was true. Milo was an expert escape artist, a four-legged Houdini who could squeeze through the smallest gaps in the fence or dart out the front door faster than you could blink. He'd usually spend an hour or two terrorizing the neighborhood squirrels or charming the ladies at the bakery for scraps, then return home with a triumphant tail wag and a muddy nose. It was a familiar pattern, a harmless eccentricity, until it wasn't. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange, we heard Frank's voice, hoarse with worry, calling Milo's name from his doorstep, again and again. Milo, here, boy, Milo. Kuanaya, the calls grew more frantic, less like a man scolding a mischievous pet, and more like a father searching for a lost child. It had been several hours, and Frank told my dad later, and Milo still hadn't returned. My dad, ever the good neighbor, offered to drive around, scanning the streets, shining his headlights into bushes, but came back empty-handed. The quiet desperation in Frank's eyes that night, the slump of his shoulders as he closed his front door, it dug a small, uneasy hole in my chest. Even then, I felt that familiar, unwelcome tug, that sense of responsibility that would later become my constant companion and my fatal flaw. The next morning, the air hung heavy, not just with the usual Oregonian damp, but with an unspoken tension. I went over to Frank's house. His kitchen, usually bustling with the clatter of breakfast dishes, was silent. Milo's food bowl sat untouched by the back door. Frank, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him, was hunched over his kitchen table, a photograph of Milo clutched in his trembling hand. I helped him make a missing poster, the kind you see tacked to bulletin boards in grocery stores, a silent plea for a lost piece of someone's life. I watched as he carefully glued Milo's photo onto a sheet of paper, his large calloused fingers fumbling with the small glue stick. I, with my neat, practiced handwriting, penned the details underneath in black marker, dictated by Frank in a voice that kept catching in his throat. We went to Elmer's Market, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of canned goods. The photocopy machine, usually costing $1 for 10 copies, spat out our duplicates without a single coin. Mr. Elmer, his kind eyes clouded with sympathy, simply waved us off. No charge, boy. Hope you find him. He bought me a cola from the cooler, the condensation beating on the can, cold against my palm. You're a good kid, Ricky, Frank said, patting my back, the gesture feeling heavy and paternal. He's a little shit, pardon my French, but I'd be lost without him. The lump in my throat grew, a tight knot of sympathy and a burgeoning sense of purpose. We'll find him, Mr. Page, I said, the words feeling too grand for my 10-year-old mouth, but uttered with all the conviction I could muster. The Brook Street sleuths are on the case. He managed a weak chuckle, a sound that held no humor, only weary resignation. I'll go knock for Luke just as soon as we put up these posters. We left one on Mr. Elmer's community board, a stark black and white plea amidst brightly colored flyers for bake sales and garage cleanouts. The remaining copies we plastered on telegraph poles and the 2 bus shelters in town, the sticky tape struggling against the damp morning air. Before I knocked for Luke, I made sure to hold on to the original photograph of Milo. It felt important, like a sacred artifact. This way, I could show it to everyone during our investigation, a tangible piece of the missing dog, a symbol of our quest. Back home, my mom was folding laundry, the scent of detergent filling the air. Don't wander too far, Ricky, she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the turmoil brewing inside me. And stay out of the woods. I don't like the thought of you boys in there alone. The woods, a dark, verdant expanse that bordered the back of town, a forbidden kingdom for unsupervised children. Of course, I absolutely planned on looking in there. It was the most logical place a dog might wander, especially an escape artist like Milo. I promised Mom I wouldn't, of course, a lie that felt necessary at the time. I grabbed my bike, the handlebars cool beneath my palms, and pedaled hard to Luke's house, the missing dog poster fluttering in my backpack like a distress signal. Luke was already waiting, his eyes alight with the thrill of a new case, though a somber one this time. We rode our bikes around town, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows. We knocked on doors, explaining our mission, holding up Milo's picture, watching the faces of strangers morph from polite curiosity to shared concern. It was mostly unsuccessful, a string of "no, haven't seen him," and "I'll keep an eye out." But then, one lady, a kind woman with a flower garden that spilled over onto the sidewalk, had a sliver of information. Now that I think about it, she mused, a finger pressed to her chin. I did see a little dog sniffing around the brambles on Maple Road yesterday. Yes, I'm almost certain that's the dog I saw. Thank you, ma'am, Luke said, his voice crisp and professional. We retrieved our bikes from the end of her driveway, our wheels crunching on the gravel. There are 2 houses on Maple Road with brambles in the yard, Luke said, already piecing together the clues. Ms. Jacobs, I supplied, picturing her neatly trimmed bushes. And the Deans. Why did it have to be the Deans? The Dean family. The very name sent a tiny shiver down my spine. They were not known for their warm community spirit. Their yard was a junkyard of rusted car parts and forgotten machinery. And then there was Tommy Dean, the oldest son, a high school senior with a reputation as a troublemaker, a hulking presence who'd caused Luke and me plenty of grief in the past. To make matters worse, the Deans had a dog of their own, a brute of a German shepherd named Kane, whose barks echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. The thought of poor Milo, a little Yorkie, crossing paths with Kane felt like a prelude to disaster. We'll go to Miss Jacobs' house first, Luke decided, ever the optimist. If we're lucky, we won't have to go to the Deans at all. It was a short ride to Maple Road. We left our bikes on the sidewalk, leaning against a neatly manicured lawn, and walked up Ms. Jacobs' pathway. Her garden was a riot of color, neatly tended, smelling of roses and damp earth. Well, she said warmly, opening her door, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. If it isn't the Brook Street sleuths, hello, Ms. Jacobs. we chorused, our voices a bit too loud, a bit too eager. "What can I do for you, boys? We're looking for my neighbor, Mr. Page's dog," I explained, holding up Milo's photograph. "He went missing yesterday afternoon." "Oh, no," she said, her smile faltering, replaced by a look of concern. "Poor Frank. I'm familiar with that little scamp. I sometimes see him in the yard by the brambles, but I haven't seen him for a few days." "Thank you anyway. Ms. Jacobs?" Luke said, a note of disappointment in his voice. "Of course," she replied. "I'll keep my eye out. Oh, and help yourselves to blackberries." She gestured towards her sprawling bramble patch, heavy with ripe, glistening berries. As we walked down her pathway, the sweetness of the berries hanging in the air, Luke and I exchanged a look of shared concern. Our brief reprieve was over. We now had to visit the Deans. We took the opportunity to eat a few of the ripened berries, their tart sweetness bursting on our tongues. A small, futile act of defiance before braving the den of the beast. Then, we wheeled our bikes down the street, their tires crunching softly on the asphalt, towards the House of Horrors. The Dean's yard was a stark contrast to Ms. Jacobs' idyllic garden. It was overgrown, a tangle of weeds and dying grass. Scraps of metal, rusted hulks of forgotten vehicles, lay strewn about like the bones of some prehistoric beasts. It wasn't just unkempt, it felt hostile. The air here was still and heavy, devoid of the chirping birds and buzzing insects that populated the rest of the neighborhood. This was a place where things went to die, or worse. We slowly, hesitantly, walked up the cracked concrete path, our footsteps feeling unnaturally loud. As soon as my knuckles brushed the door, a sudden explosion of loud, furious barking erupted from inside, making us both jump back, a raw, primal sound that vibrated through the wood. Footsteps pounded, then a guttural shout. "Shut the hell up!" The door flew open, revealing Mr. Dean, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched on his face, struggling to hold back Kane, their monstrous German shepherd, by a thick leather collar. The dog was a snarling, teeth-baring fury, straining against his leash, its eyes locked onto us with predatory intensity, a low growl rumbling in its massive chest. "What do you want?" Mr. Dean snarled, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "Hello, sir," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum. "We're asking around to see if anyone has seen my neighbor's dog." I held up Milo's picture. The small Yorkie's innocent face, a stark contrast to the snarling beast before us. "He went missing yesterday. And what makes you think I had anything to do with it?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing, suspicion hardening his features. "It's not like that, sir," Luke interjected, his voice surprisingly steady. "We're just asking if you've seen him. That's all. He sometimes wanders around the neighborhood." Mr. Dean let out a short, humorless laugh, a harsh, grating sound. "Who do you think you are? Columbo or some shit?" Luke and I exchanged a look, a silent communication that conveyed our immediate regret. This was a bad idea, a very bad idea. The air thrummed with a dangerous energy, a coiled aggression that made my skin crawl. "We're sorry to have bothered you, sir," I said, already turning to leave, my legs feeling heavy, like I was moving through thick mud. "Believe me," he scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "If that rat had been anywhere near here, Kane would have sorted it out." The German shepherd let out another low, rumbling growl, a promise of violence. We hurried back down the path, the sound of the dog's renewed barking chasing us, a chilling echo in the otherwise quiet afternoon. We jumped on our bikes, our movements clumsy with haste, and pedaled like demons were hot on our heels, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We didn't stop until we rounded the corner, out of sight of the Dean's house, gasping for breath. The uncomfortable laughter that bubbled out of us then was born of pure adrenaline and raw relief. "God, I hate that family," Luke wheezed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Just then, the roar of an engine split the quiet, and a rust bucket of a car, its paint peeling like old skin, came hurtling around the corner, its tires screeching on the asphalt. It was Tommy Dean behind the wheel, his face a smirk of casual cruelty. When he noticed Luke and me, he lifted a hand, not in greeting, but to give us the finger, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement, before he sped away, vanishing down the road in a cloud of exhaust. "So suspicious," I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But maybe too obvious?" Luke shrugged, his shoulders still heaving from the exertion. "They're assholes. Yeah, but I think we need to investigate more first. Rule number 1, follow the evidence, not the feeling." Wise words from a 10-year-old. I suppose it was true, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The Deans were the kind of people who felt wrong, even when you couldn't put your finger on why. It was an instinct that would, in later years, save my life more times than I could count. When it felt like we'd exhausted all avenues in town, our energy flagging, our hopes dwindling, I suggested the woods. The idea hung in the air, heavy and forbidden. Luke was apprehensive, his usual bravado tempered by the strict warnings from our parents. The woods were off limits, a wild, untamed place where shadows stretched long and anything could hide. But it seemed logical, didn't it? A dog, especially one who loved to chase chipmunks, would surely be drawn to the untamed expanse of trees and undergrowth. If we do find Milo there, I reasoned, we'll just pretend we found him someplace that won't get us in trouble. The lie felt hollow even as I said it, but the thought of Milo, lost and alone, twisted in my gut. My reluctant conscience, even then, was a stubborn thing, pulling me into danger despite every instinct to flee. The woods, when we entered them, were darker than I expected, even with the afternoon sun dappling through the canopy. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly cloying. The trees were ancient, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out the sky like a thick, green blanket. We stumbled over exposed roots, pushed through prickly bushes, our voices echoing strangely as we shouted Milo's name from time to time. "Milo! Here, boy! Milo!" Our cries seemed to be swallowed by the silent immensity of the forest, absorbed into the whispering leaves and the rustling undergrowth. We searched for an hour or so, the hope slowly draining out of us with each passing minute. It got to the point where we figured if Milo was somewhere he could hear us, he would have made himself known by now. He was a yapper, after all. Before we gave up entirely, the urgency of nature called. Both of us suddenly, desperately, needed a bathroom. "I'll go this way," Luke said, pointing towards a particularly dense thicket. "You go that way." We separated, plunging deeper into the quiet, unsettling embrace of the woods, seeking secluded spots. The silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of unseen birds, felt heavier now, more watchful. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine, a nascent awareness that something was not quite right, though I couldn't articulate why. My analog wristwatch, a hand-me-down from my grandfather, felt heavy on my wrist, a comforting, familiar weight. I found myself tracing the rim of its face, a nervous tic I didn't even know I was developing. Then, a scream. Luke's voice, sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the stillness like a jagged piece of glass. "Ricky!" My heart leaped into my throat. I quickly finished, fumbling with my bike, my hands clumsy with sudden terror. "Where are you?" I yelled, my voice cracking, my nerves stretched taut. "Over here!" His voice was strained, breathless. I scrambled through the undergrowth, pushing aside branches, the adrenaline a sudden, bitter taste in my mouth. I burst into a small clearing, my breath ragged, and saw him. Luke was standing there, frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with an unspeakable horror. He didn't need to answer my frantic question. The clearing was a sick mockery of nature's tranquility. In the center, a crude slab of stone, dark and ancient, lay embedded in the earth. On its surface, drawn in a stark, unsettling white chalk, were 3 triangles, all pointing the same way but overlapping each other, forming a single, disturbing symbol. And in the very heart of that symbol, a single, severed animal paw. Its fur, a familiar auburn, was matted with dried, dark crust. It was Milo's. The sight hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Around the stone, on the rough bark of several tree trunks, crude, unsettling symbols were drawn. Not chalk this time. No, the dark, rusty hue, the faint, metallic tang that now filled the air. The way it seemed to shimmer faintly in the dappled light. It was blood. Fresh blood. "Oh my God," I whispered, the words barely audible, lost in the sudden, overwhelming dread that choked me. My stomach lurched, threatening to betray me. "I really want to leave now," Luke said, his voice a strangled whisper, fear making him sound years younger. I nodded, my head swimming. "Yeah, come on!" The words were a desperate plea, a desperate need to escape this defilement. The horror had a name now, and it was much more terrible than a simple lost dog. As I turned to grab my bike, my eyes, now hyper-vigilant, caught on something small, half hidden by a moss-covered log, a satchel, a dark canvas bag, looking incongruous in the ancient woods. I walked towards it, a strange, morbid curiosity overriding my terror. Luke spotted it too. "Leave it, Ricky," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. "Don't touch it." "It's evidence," I retorted, the detective instinct, however childish, kicking in. My hand reached out, then hesitated. Instinct, that cold, hard little voice that would one day keep me alive, told me not to contaminate the scene. My fingers trembled as I found a fallen stick, its rough bark against my skin, and used it to lift the flap of the satchel. I peeked inside, a pack of cigarettes and some school textbooks, senior biology and math, not elementary school, not middle school. Senior? "Student," I murmured, the word feeling oddly out of place. My mind, racing, connected the dots. Senior. Tommy Dean. My hands still shaking. I found a large, broad leaf, its surface smooth and cool, and used it to cover my fingertips. Carefully, ever so carefully. I opened the first page of the biology book. Written in pencil, in the top right corner, in a messy, aggressive hand, Tommy Dean. A shiver, cold and bone deep, went through me. Not just the chill of the woods, but the icy hand of dawning realization. Tommy Dean, the brute from the Dean house, the one whose dog would sort out Milo, the one who had just given us the finger from his rust bucket car. It was too perfect, too sickening. I told Luke, my voice barely a thread, and his eyes widened to match mine, reflecting the same dawning horror. We didn't need another word. We didn't need to discuss it. We got on our bikes and rode like the wind, the scent of blood and fear, a phantom presence in our nostrils, heading straight for the sheriff's office. We burst through the double doors, the bell above jingling frantically, announcing our frantic arrival. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. "Whoa, fellas," Deputy Campbell said, looking up from behind his desk, his uniform crisp, his face a picture of calm, weary authority. He looked like the kind of man who dealt with lost cats and speeding tickets, not ritualistic animal sacrifice. "Calm yourself now. What seems to be the problem?" We tried to explain, both of us talking at once, tripping over our words, the story tumbling out in a confused cascade of fear and accusations. Milo, the woods, blood, Paul, Tommy Dean, symbols. Deputy Campbell, to his credit, didn't laugh. He listened, his brow furrowed, his expression slowly morphing from mild amusement to serious concern. And then, a flicker of something else, disbelief. But then, seeing the raw terror in our eyes, the trembling of our hands, the desperate earnestness of our voices, he made a decision. He escorted us back to the woods, his face grim, his hand resting on the holster of his service pistol. When he saw the clearing, saw the stone slab, the chalk symbols, the severed paw, the blood on the trees, he blanched. "Sweet mother of Jesus," he muttered, the expletive a hushed prayer. He pulled out his radio, his voice crackling with urgency, calling it in. The woods, so silent moments before, were soon swarming with uniformed officers. Dogs, canine units, sniffed at the ground, their handlers' voices low and serious. Detectives, their faces hard and unreadable, took photographs, collected samples, marked evidence. It was a scene from one of our detective shows, but this time it was terrifyingly real. There was a search conducted at the dean's house. I heard about it through the walls that night, after my parents had banished me to my room, too shaken and disturbed by what I'd seen to be allowed near the TV. My dad's voice, low and grave, carried through the thin plaster. "They found it all, honey, in Tommy's bedroom, an ancient book of the occult, full of those same symbols. And Milo's collar?" The last words were almost a whisper, heavy with grim finality. Apparently, Tommy protested his innocence as they took him in for questioning, but the evidence was overwhelming. My stomach churned, a knot of nausea twisting inside me. Poor Mr. Page was devastated. The disturbing and gruesome nature of it all rocked our sleepy community, tearing a gaping hole in its idyllic facade. People talked in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear and disgust. Luke and I, however, were commended for our help in the investigation. We received honorary badges from the sheriff's department, shiny, fake gold stars that felt heavy and real in our hands. They were supposed to make us feel like real investigators, heroes even. And for a couple of days, they did. For a couple of days, the horror was overshadowed by the pride, the naive, childish pride of a job well done. I didn't know then that heroism had a steep price, one paid not in candy bars and sodas, but in the currency of sanity and peace of mind. After a couple of days, Ms. Jacobs required our services again. My mom was reluctant for me to carry on playing detective, as she called it, her voice strained, her eyes still holding a shadow of the fear that had gripped the town. But my dad, perhaps seeing the need for some semblance of normalcy, talked her around. "Let him go, honey. It'll be good for him. Get his mind off things." He didn't understand that some things, once seen, can never be truly gotten off. Luke and I went to visit Ms. Jacobs late that afternoon, the memory of the past few days still a raw wound beneath the surface. As we approached her house, a wonderful smell wafted from it, warm and inviting. Blackberries. "Take a seat, boy," she said, her smile as warm and comforting as the blackberry pie that sat cooling on her kitchen counter. "I baked you a blackberry pie. Call it a thank you for your services to the community." "Thanks, Miss Jacobs," we both said, a childish eagerness overcoming the lingering unease. We scrambled onto the dining chairs, the polished wood cool beneath our palms. The pie, still warm, sat in the center of the table, its deep purple filling bubbling enticingly, the lattice crust perfectly golden. She cut 2 generous slices, the knife sinking easily through the flaky pastry, and plated them up, handing us one each. "Bon appetit," she smiled, taking a seat opposite us as we started tucking into the delicious pie, its sweetness a welcome distraction. "Well done on your investigation. That must have been quite a shock discovering such a gruesome scene." Luke nodded, his mouth full. "It was scary, wasn't it? Ricky?" "Yeah," I agreed, chewing slowly, the tartness of the blackberries a pleasant counterpoint to the buttery crust. "But we handled it like professionals. She chuckled, a soft, pleasant sound. I'm sure you did. I always knew that Tommy Dean was a rotten apple. I can't help but wonder what it was all for. Though, why sacrifice that little dog? Luke and I looked at each other, shrugging with mouthfuls of pie, unable to offer an answer. The adults, we'd learned, often had questions we couldn't comprehend. And those symbols, she continued, her voice dropping, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. What did they mean? My dad said it was devil worship, Luke volunteered, always eager to share the latest adult gossip. I'm sure he's right, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. To think I'd only seen that poor dog a few hours before Tommy took him. I can't help but think I could have done something to help. She reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch surprisingly cold, though I dismissed it as my imagination. Thank goodness you heroes found those school books of his at the scene. Imagine what else he could have done if it weren't for you. I dread to think. Luke and I exchanged another glance, this one filled with a surge of renewed pride. We were heroes. We'd helped. We'd saved the day. The bitter taste of fear and horror began to recede, replaced by the sweet aftertaste of heroism. Excuse me a moment, she said, rising from her seat. I'll be right back. The moment she left the room, the hushed, giddy exclamations burst forth. We're heroes, I chuckled, unable to contain the surge of triumph. We found the villain and saved the day, Luke giggled, a smear of blackberry pie on his cheek. We kept tucking into the pie, the sweetness dissolving on our tongues, the taste of victory. But as I chewed, slowly, deliberately, a small, insidious worm of unease began to burrow into my mind. Something wasn't quite right. A tiny, dissonant note in the symphony of our triumph. My observational skills, honed by years of trying to decipher cryptic adult conversations and subtle shifts in facial expressions, began to work overtime. Then it hit me, a sudden, cold jolt that made the pie in my mouth feel like ash. My eyes widened, my heart suddenly racing again. Wait, I said, the word barely a whisper. Didn't Ms. Jacob say she hadn't seen Milo for days when we were investigating? Luke shrugged, oblivious, still savoring his pie. Yeah, so? But she just said she saw him a few hours before. Tommy took him, his brow furrowed, a slow dawning of confusion spreading across his face. Oh, yeah, she is an old lady, though, Ricky, my grandma is very forgetful. I contemplated it. An old lady, forgetting things. It was a plausible explanation, one that would make the world make sense again. But it still didn't feel right. It was a slight discrepancy, a tiny crack in the story. But it was enough to let the cold dread seep in. My eyes widened further, fixed on Luke, who was still idly chewing. My hand, without conscious thought, went to my wristwatch, tracing the cold metal of the casing, a nascent nervous tick. The sheriff's department didn't release the evidence, I said, the words barely a whisper, a thread of ice in my throat. They said it was part of an ongoing investigation. How does she know about the books? Luke's eyes, bright with the fading afterglow of pride, widened to match mine. The color drained from his face as the implication slammed into him. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then, Miss Jacobs came back into the room. She was smiling, a warm, pleasant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Those eyes, I noticed now, were too bright, too keen, holding an ancient, unsettling knowing. Will you look at that, she said, her voice lilting, a predatory purr. You've almost finished your pie. Let me cut you another slice. She moved towards us, a slow, deliberate grace to her steps. No, I blurted out, the words sharp, desperate. I cleared my throat, trying to regain some composure, some semblance of the polite child I was supposed to be. It was delicious. Ms. Jacobs, but very filling. Very well, she smiled, her eyes lingering on us, a hungry gleam in their depths. Let me take this dish away then. She reached for the pie dish, her fingers long and slender, but somehow wrong. As she lifted the ceramic dish from the table, Luke and I both stared, our blood running cold, our breaths catching in our throats. Scratched deeply into the polished wooden surface of the dining table were 3 triangles, overlapping each other, identical to the symbol we'd seen drawn in blood in the woods, the same symbol that had been drawn in chalk on the sacrificial stone. "Oh yes," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet amusement. "There was a mystery for you to solve. Boys, a mystery ingredient. I wonder if you've got the detective skills to work it out." Her smile widened, showing teeth that seemed a little too long, a little too sharp. Luke looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears, his lower lip trembling. I felt exactly the same. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. He coughed a little, a strangled, choking sound, and put his fingers to his mouth, pulling something out, a small, dark strand. "What is it, Luke?" she asked, her voice a low, cooing sound, her head cocked to the side, a predator observing its prey. He covered his mouth, a desperate gagging sound escaping him. "Hair! Clue number 1, as she said, her smile never faltering. And you, Ricky?" I shook my head, my voice gone, replaced by a cold nod of terror. "We'd like to leave now, Miss Jacobs." "Nonsense," she said, her voice hardening, losing its pleasant veneer. She plucked my plate away, her fingers brushing mine, sending a jolt of icy fear through me. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed the now empty pie dish directly in front of me. "Go on," she purred. "Have a look." I looked at Luke, who was clearly terrified, his eyes wide and pleading. My hands trembled, my very bones feeling brittle, but something, that stubborn, self-destructive streak of responsibility, the need to know, forced my hand. I picked up the fork. My fingers brushed the cool metal, the familiar weight a small comfort in the rising tide of horror. Slowly, deliberately, my vision blurring, I began to pull pieces of the remaining pastry away, digging through the thick, dark purple filling. It was like sifting through something viscous and unnatural. Then, my fork made a distinct, sickening clink sound against something hard. I froze. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to run, to forget. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away. I couldn't let it go. My fingers, numb and clumsy, reached into the viscous, dark purple goo. I could instantly feel what it was. Not a berry, not a piece of fruit. It was long, curved, and hard. A tooth, a long canine tooth. I threw it across the table with a guttural cry. The sound ripped from my very soul, pushing myself back from the table with such force that my chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. I grabbed Luke's arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. "Run!" I yelled, my voice hoarse, raw with terror. "Now!" We scrambled, a tangle of limbs and panic, making a desperate dash for the door. But before we could reach it, before our frantic hands could even touch the doorknob, it slammed shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the room like a death knell. The light that had been filtering through the windows, already dimming with the approaching twilight, now seemed to drain away entirely, plunging the room into an unnatural gloom. The symbol on the table, the 3 overlapping triangles, began to glow. A faint, malevolent red, as if it were drawn in embers, pulsating with an unseen, ancient power. Luke and I, paralyzed by the sheer terror, could only stand there, arms wrapped around each other, sniveling, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before us. Our childish understanding of the world, of good and evil, of what was real and what was fantasy, snapped like dry twigs. Ms. Jacob smiled from across the room. It was no longer the warm, kindly smile of the neighborhood baker. It was a predator's grin, wide and impossibly sharp. Her hair, suddenly unbound, flowed around her as if caught in a breeze that only she could feel. Dark tendrils swirling like smoke. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was no longer just the metallic tang of blood, but something cloying and ancient, like earth and decay. "What are your findings, boys?" she purred, her voice deepening, losing its pleasant, human timbre. The Brook Street sleuths must be able to figure it out. "You killed Milo," I screamed, the words tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. And the thought of it, the horrifying, gut-wrenching implication of what we had found in the pie, made me gag. "Bravo!" she clapped, a slow, deliberate sound, her hands no longer soft, twisting into something gnarled and claw-like. "Make the sacrifice, feed the innocent." Her words were an ancient chant, a chilling revelation. "But why?" Luke screamed, his voice high-pitched and broken, tears streaming down his face. "I am 732 years old," she cackled, the sound a dry, rattling hiss that scraped against my ears, a sound of unimaginable age and depravity. "That takes a bit of black magic to maintain." With a speed that defied her apparent age, a movement too swift for human eyes to follow, she lunged. She grabbed Luke, her clawed hand wrapping around his arm, impossibly strong. I tried to pull him away, my own hand scrabbling uselessly at her arm, but with a flick of her wrist, a gesture of casual, horrifying power, I was flung backwards, slamming against the wall, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. She threw Luke down onto the glowing symbol on the table, a sickening thud. He screamed out, a raw, piercing sound of agony as wisps of dark, acrid smoke began to rise around him, curling up from the symbol like an offering. "It burns," he screamed, his voice choked with pain, his body writhing. "Leave him alone," I cried, my voice hoarse, tears streaming down my face, my body aching with a desperate, futile need to help him. She turned to me then, her head tilting to the side, a slow, deliberate movement. The features that had made her Jacob's, the familiar, kindly face of our neighbor, faded, melted away like wax, revealing something ancient and utterly decayed beneath. Loose, leathery skin hung from visible bones, stretched taut over a skull that seemed too large, too alien. Her eye sockets were empty, dark, gaping holes, no hint of humanity left within them. Wispy strands of brittle, gray hair, like dried moss, clung to her scalp. Her teeth, impossibly long and pointed, were surrounded by split, leathery gums, a grotesque parody of a smile. The air grew colder, heavy with the stench of the grave, of things that should have remained buried. "You next, Ricky!" she yelled, her voice no longer Ms. Jacob's gentle cadence, but a deep, guttural roar, demonic and ancient, a sound that vibrated in my very bones. Her mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should. It stretched, distended, the jaw unhinging, revealing a black, cavernous void lined with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to shift and writhe. And then, she took Luke's whole head inside. The sight was so utterly, viscerally wrong, so profoundly against the laws of nature, that my mind simply shut down. His arms and legs began to kick about, a horrifying, desperate dance of flailing limbs, as I could hear his muffled groans coming from inside her, wet, sickening sounds of struggle and ultimate defeat. There were snapping sounds, wet and loud, as parts of her dislocated, her body twisting and contorting like a snake swallowing its prey, making room for him, forcing him down. Before long, his shoulders could no longer be seen, swallowed by the grotesque, pulsating mass that had once been a human being. She made greedy, guttural noises, a satisfied gurgle, as she forced his body down her throat, chewing, grinding, swallowing. I was paralyzed against the wall, utterly helpless, forced to watch as my best friend, my partner in childhood adventures, was eaten alive. I could feel my mind snapping, a cacophony of small, sharp cracks, like her ancient bones. Luke's legs were still kicking, a last, desperate, pathetic struggle. Even as she reached his knees, her long, bony fingers tipped with black, talon-like nails, gripped around his ankles, pushing the last bit of him inside, into the wet, consuming darkness. Then, a loud bang, an explosion of noise that startled her as much as it startled me, ripping me from the nightmare. The dining room door, previously sealed by some unseen force, flew open, splintering against the frame. 3 officers burst into the room, led by Deputy Campbell, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Sweet folking mother of Jesus," he yelled, the expletive a desperate cry, his voice cracking as he took aim at what was once Jacobs. She retched, a terrible, wet, gagging sound. And then, Luke's whole body slipped out of her mouth, covered in a glistening, translucent goo, collapsing onto the table with a sickening splat. He was still, unmoving, a cocoon of horror. I fell from the wall, hitting the floor with a sickening thud, my body a puppet with severed strings. The officers opened fire on her, the deafening cracks of their pistols echoing in the small room, muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the horror. She recoiled, forced back by the barrage, letting out a multi-layered scream that was part human shriek, part ancient, monstrous bellow. The window shattered, glass exploding inwards, and natural light, the blessed, glorious light of the sun, poured into the room, making her scream even louder, as if she were burnt by its cleansing rays, driven by a primal surge of something beyond fear, something desperate and unthinking. I scrambled forward. I ran to Luke, pulling him from the table, my hands slipping on the viscous coating. He was still, utterly still, but then, a faint, shallow gasp, a single ragged breath, relief, sharp and painful, flooded me. He was breathing. He was alive. The glowing symbol on the table was fading, its malevolent light flickering, dying, and with a final piercing shriek that seemed to tear the very air, the thing that had been Ms. Jacobs became a swirling cloud of dark smoke. It wasn't just dissipating, it was seemingly sucked inwards, drawn into the fading symbol, consumed by the very ritual it performed. Then, everything went deathly silent for a few seconds, the echoes of gunfire and screams slowly fading, replaced by the ringing in my ears. As it happened, Tommy Dean, even in his callous self-interest, had played a part. When he was taken in, he insisted on his innocence, claiming he'd seen Miss Jacobs on his property and that his satchel had gone missing afterwards. He must have been trying to deflect, to shift the blame. But Deputy Campbell, a good man despite the bizarre nature of the claim, pursued it. He managed to convince the sheriff to investigate Miss Jacobs, even if just to humor a juvenile delinquent. Thank God he did. Thank God for that one small flicker of unlikely justice, because Luke and I would not be here today if it wasn't for him. We carry the mental scars, deep and indelible, but we live. Suffice to say, the Brook Street sleuths were no more after that day. That day, the world became a much larger, much darker place. That day, the whispers in the shadows gained form, and I, Leo Vance, learned that some mysteries don't end with a solution, but with a beginning, the beginning of a long, weary journey, forever on the run from the things that found me in the quiet streets of a small town and have been following me ever since. Character count 9987. The slick sheen of the old laminated contract mocked me, each word a splinter driven deeper into my already tattered psyche. My name, emblazoned there in a crude, almost childlike font, seemed to vibrate with a silent scream. Jerry Brown to be dropped at restaurant back door by 8 a.m. $75,000 cash will be dropped at your residence by noon of the same day. The letters swam, then solidified, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of my childhood, into the twisted memory of a man I had called father. The stench of dust and decay in this forgotten corner of the house suddenly clung to my throat like a shroud, and I crumpled, the flimsy paper a lead weight in my trembling hand. The world tilted, the air tasting of metal and betrayal, and all I could hear was the frantic, desperate thrumming of my own blood in my ears, a symphony of a life unraveled by a horror far older and more intimate than any roadside ghost. The ridge of my old worn leather jacket was slung over the back of a hardback chair, just like it always was. Even in this stagnant, unloved house, I was in Dingwall of all places, a forgotten speck on the map of my restless life, trying to make sense of what was left behind. My father's house. He'd finally kicked the bucket, not with a bang, but with a wheeze and a terminal diagnosis that even his gambling addiction couldn't cheat. I wasn't here for closure. That was a fool's errand. I was here because someone had to be, to tie up the loose ends before the bank moved in. My reluctant conscience, as I often cursed it, had dragged me back, just as it always seemed to drag me into every goddamn mess. I checked my analog wristwatch, 3:17 p.m. The hands moved, uncaring, a constant in a world of variables. The place smelled of stale tobacco, dust, and something indefinably old, like forgotten grief. I'd been working through boxes in the attic, each one a Pandora's box of faded photographs, brittle letters, and the detritus of a life lived largely in shadows. It was a chore, a grim penance for a past I barely remembered, or perhaps, subconsciously, didn't want to. My own childhood here was a blur, fragmented by the kind of gaps trauma etches into the mind. I remembered the house, yes, but the people who lived in it, my family, they were more like characters in a half-forgotten story, always just out of focus. My father had always been a distant figure, his life a chaotic dance between his two obsessions. Ross County Fay, and the insatiable maw of his gambling addiction. There were always arguments, hushed whispers behind closed doors, the frantic clatter of coins. And then there was Mickey, my older brother, gone, swallowed by the earth in 1996. When I was just a 4-year-old tag-along, 11 years old, Mickey had been a face in faded photographs, a name whispered with a quiet, lingering sadness. The police searched, the community mourned, but nothing, just a void. I remembered the hysterical grief of my mother, a raw, primal scream that seemed to echo in the very fabric of this house. And then, 2 years later, 1998, she too was gone. A car accident, faulty seatbelt, the official report had claimed, ejecting her from the vehicle. I remembered my teacher, a kind but grim-faced woman, driving me to the hospital, the sterile smell, the quiet pronouncement. My father survived, of course, lucky him, or perhaps unlucky me. I picked up another box, this one heavier than the others, tucked away in the deepest recess of a dusty wardrobe. It wasn't labeled, just taped shut with industrial-grade packing tape, as if its contents were meant to be forgotten. Buried, my fingers calloused from years of hauling freight and stacking crates. Fumbled with the tape. A cloud of fine gray dust puffed into the air as the lid creaked open. Inside, it wasn't the usual collection of old newspapers or sentimental trinkets. This was different. This box hummed with a low, disquieting energy, a whisper of secrets that had been gathering dust for decades. Bank letters, repossession notices, bankruptcy documents, a grim litany of financial ruin. The kind of stuff I'd half expected. My father was a gambler, after all. But then, beneath the usual paperwork, I saw them. Letters of correspondence from an insurance agency. My mother's accident, investigation reports, statements. My breath hitched. I usually avoided anything connected to that period. A self-preservation instinct honed by years of running from things that defy easy explanation. But the relentless pull of my reluctant conscience wouldn't let me look away. I pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, the edges yellowed and brittle. The report confirmed the faulty seatbelt, the ejection. But then, my eyes snagged on a paragraph, a detail I'd never known, never been told. Mr. Brown, you have opted for a lump sum payment of $125,000, 125,000 pounds. The number hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My father, living in a house that always felt like it was crumbling around us, always struggling, always chasing the next bet. He had come into that kind of money, and where the hell had it gone? My cynical mind immediately supplied the answer. The track, the bookies, the dark, hungry maw of his addiction. But even as the thought formed, a cold, wet tendril of dread began to coil in my gut. This felt wrong, too big, too quiet. My fingers, almost of their own volition, delved deeper into the box. Beneath the insurance papers, tucked away in a manila folder, was a single grainy photocopy, a handwritten contract. The paper was creased, blurred in places, as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times, its secrets both guarded and examined. It was dated 1996, the year Mickey disappeared. My heart began to beat an erratic drum against my ribs. I squinted, trying to make out the faded ink. It spoke of dealings, meeting places, times for transportation of goods. The words seemed innocuous enough, on the surface, but the context, the date, the general air of clandestine secrecy, it set off every alarm bell in my head. Years of dealing with the abnormal, with the things that slithered in the unseen corners of the world, had taught me to trust that gnawing feeling of wrongness. Then, the final line, stark and horrifyingly clear. Michael Brown to be dropped off at the restaurant back door at 7 a.m. $50,000 cash will be dropped off at your residence by midday on the same day in a brown leather single-strap bag. My breath caught in my throat. Michael Brown, Mickey, dropped off at a restaurant for 50,000 pounds. The words pulsed on the page, a grotesque accusation. What restaurant? My eyes darted to the top of the page, where a partial logo, mostly cut off, was visible. McDimples, the name, half remembered from childhood, slammed into me with the force of a concrete block. McDimples, the cheap, garish fast food joint where my father used to take me after Ross County matches. The place he'd taken Mickey, too. The place with the creepy mascot, Reggie McDimple, a clown with unsettlingly large dimples and a voice like nails on a chalkboard. My mind, usually a fortress of cynicism, felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed. I vaguely remembered it, a brightly lit, slightly grimy oasis in the damp Scottish evenings. A blatant McDonald's ripoff. Even I, as a child, had registered that. The Big Stack, the Whooper, knockoffs of knockoffs, and the Smile Meal, for kids with its broken or used toys. I remembered the zombified teenagers behind the counter, punching orders into archaic machines, sliding food through a greasy hatch, always super fast service, always suspicious. My observational skills, even then, were already kicking in, registering the pervasive oddness, the slight wrongness in the air that others seemed to ignore. And Reggie, God, Reggie, the memory of him sent a shiver down my spine, a ghost of childhood unease. He'd prance around, red and black tattered clothes, a grotesque china doll face with those two huge, unsettling dimples. His voice, a funny, affected American accent. His shrill, annoying laugh when someone lost a game. "Oh, shucks, better luck next time," he'd cackle, twisting his fingers in those dimples, his loose jaw flapping. I'd lost a lot of those games. My father, usually so aloof, would encourage me, even push me to play. I was shy, uncoordinated. I'd seen the flicker of disappointment in his eyes when I inevitably fumbled, failed, lost. I'd always attributed it to a father's natural desire for his kid to win, to try new things. A small, pathetic ambition on his part. But now, the context shifted. The image of his disappointment transformed into something monstrous, something unspeakable. I remembered the staff. They always looked vacant, drugged, perhaps. My cynical adult mind could see it clearly now. The hollow eyes, the slow movements, the way they seemed to exist in a perpetual haze. As a kid, I'd asked my dad why they were always tired. He just grunted, waved me off. Another detail that clicked into place. Another piece of the macabre mosaic. McDimple's had closed suddenly. I remembered that too. The day before it closed was the only time I'd ever won one of Reggie's games. My father, for once, had been genuinely excited, beaming, talking about the McDimple's factory tour we'd won for the next day. I remembered his crushed face, the almost palpable sense of devastation. When we arrived the next morning to find the building boarded up, desolate, I'd been confused then, a child unable to grasp the magnitude of an adult's disappointment over a silly fast food joint. It's just a restaurant, I'd thought, but he'd spent a lot of time there with Mickey. Now, I knew why. My fingers scrambled, rummaging through the box, a growing nausea churning in my gut. Newspaper clippings, dozens of them, all about Mickey's disappearance, the community efforts, the dead ends, and then the new ones, McDimple's headed letters, dates 1997, 1999, 2000, and then 2002. Another photocopied contract, the same details, meeting places, transportation, and the crucial detail that now, having seen Mickey's name, solidified the horror into an unshakable, agonizing truth. My name, Jerry Brown, to be dropped at restaurant back door by 8 a.m. $75,000 cash will be dropped at your residence by noon of the same day. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out on my forehead. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was pinning me down. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an amputation, a severing of any remaining threads of innocence, of any belief in the fundamental good of my own kin. It was the ultimate betrayal, delivered 2 decades too late. Beneath that contract, more newspaper clippings. Recent ones. The Rossshire Journal, local fast food restaurant McDimple's, has been raided in the early hours of this morning. My eyes darted across the text, skimming, searching for confirmation, for a way to deny this unspeakable reality. Evidence of child trafficking has led police to popular fast food restaurant McDimple's, which has now been under surveillance for several months. The words blurred, then sharpened, each one a shard of glass in my mind. Trafficking. Children. McDimple's. My brother. Me. I grabbed another clipping, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. McDimple's trafficking scandal. McDimple's owner disappears after link to child trafficking discovered. Police raid McDimple's restaurant linked to trafficking children. The headlines screamed, echoes of a horror I had somehow, miraculously, escaped. I pulled out the last one, the most recent, the one that spelled out the full, agonizing truth. An ex-employee, anonymous, recounting the horror. Reggie McDimple, not his real name, keeping staff drugged, dependent, unspeakable beatings and torture if they ever stepped out of line. And then, the part that turned my stomach inside out, twisting it into a knot of sick, burning rage. She went on to say how Reggie McDimple, would have scores of struggling parents come to his restaurant, ready and willing to offer their children for thousands of pounds. They would organize games for the kids where the winner would then be taken to be sold and the parents given large sums of money. My father, my own father, the man who taught me to kick a football, who'd sit beside me at freezing matches, bundled in scarves, his face ruddy with the cold, the man I'd tried to rationalize, to understand, to forgive for his flaws. He wasn't just a gambler, he was a monster. He had sold Mickey. He had planned to sell me. The games, his disappointment when I lost, the ecstatic joy when I won that one time, the factory tour he was so eager for. It wasn't about a prize. It was about the drop-off. It was about the money. He wasn't disappointed in my losing the game. He was disappointed I hadn't won my way into a child trafficking ring. The very thought, raw and visceral, made bile rise in my throat. And my mother, her death, the faulty seatbelt. My father had survived. Had he done it? Had he unclipped her belt, ensuring her death, to collect that life insurance payout, to fuel his addiction? The thought was a searing brand on my soul, hotter than any fire I'd ever fled. It was the ultimate grotesque irony. I had grown up believing I was cursed, a magnet for the macabre, always running from an indistinct, burning horror in my past. But the deepest, most personal horror had been right there, in my own home, in the hands of my own flesh and blood. The owner of the restaurant had gone on the run, unlocated, no justice, just this chilling, tangible proof, tucked away in a dusty box, waiting for me to find it. My father had died, taking his secrets with him, but leaving behind a paper trail designed to shatter any remaining illusion of peace or normalcy I might have clung to. I stood there, swaying, the world around me silent, save for the frantic beat of my heart. The worn leather of my jacket felt heavy on my shoulders, a familiar comfort now imbued with the weight of this new, profound betrayal. My hand, instinctively, went to my analog wristwatch, tracing the cool metal, not for the time, just for the grounding, for the fragile hope that a simple, mechanical certainty might anchor me in a world that had just proven itself infinitely more monstrous than I'd ever dared to imagine. The past wasn't just a vague, burning memory I ran from. It was a live wire, sparking and crackling, ready to electrocute me with every new, horrifying revelation. I picked up the go bag I always kept packed, its familiar weight a reassurance. This place, this house, this town, they were poisoned now. There was nothing for me here but the ghosts of a monstrous past. I had to move. I always had to move, because the monsters didn't just hide in the shadows of desolate highways or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they wore the faces of the people you called family. And that, I realized with a chilling certainty, was the most terrifying horror of all. Character count 923. The first thing I felt was the cold, not the dry, sterile chill of the apartment's air conditioning, but something ancient and wet, like the breath of a tomb exhaling in the darkness. It seeped into the worn leather of my jacket, through my thin sleep shirt, and settled deep in my bones. My eyes snapped open, but the room was a canvas of impenetrable black. Then came the sound, a low, grating rasp, like something dragging sharpened claws across stone, or perhaps in the oppressive silence of our shared bedroom. Something far more delicate, like fingernails tracing a fresh grave. It wasn't the familiar scurry of rats. This was too deliberate, too present. My hands slick with a sudden, cold sweat, instinctively went to the battered face of my analog wristwatch. Not to check the time, what was time to this, but for the grounding weight of it, the simple, mechanical truth in a world that had long since forgotten such luxuries. The luminous hands glowed 3:07 a.m., always 3 a.m. The witching hour, the hour when the veil thinned, when whatever dark currents pulled me into their orbit decided it was time to collect. I bit back a curse, tasting bile. Just another Tuesday. The scratching intensified, a rhythmic scrape coming from the wall directly behind Shane's bed. My breath hitched. Shane. I couldn't see him, but the darkness in the room felt thicker around his side. I pushed myself back against the headboard, feeling the cheap plaster dig into my spine, and strained my eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. Was he awake? Was he making the noise? The thought was a chilling one, given how he'd been acting. A new kind of noise now, a faint, wet snicking sound, like a dog lapping water, but too slow, too heavy, too deliberate. Then, a sudden, blinding flash. Not a light, but an absence of light, a momentary implosion of photons. And in that vacuum, I saw him, Shane. He wasn't just sitting up, he was ramrod straight, feet planted on the floor, his entire posture radiating an unnatural stillness that screamed wrongness, and his face, bathed in the sickly green glow of the digital alarm clock on his nightstand. His face was a mask of pure malevolence. A grin, wide and utterly alien, stretched his lips, showing too much gum, too many teeth. His eyes, twin pits of obsidian, fixed on me, piercing the darkness of the room, piercing me. A cold, crushing weight settled on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could practically feel the tendrils of fear coiling in my gut, a familiar, unwelcome serpent. This wasn't my brother. "What the hell are you doing, man?" I croaked, my voice a pathetic whisper against the crushing presence that filled the room. The air was thick, suffocating, as if every particle had turned to lead. It pressed against my eardrums, buzzed behind my eyes. Breathing became a conscious, desperate effort. Still, he didn't reply, just watched, that terrible, knowing grin plastered across his face. Then, movement. Behind Shane, on the wall, a shadow began to crawl. It wasn't the shifting shadow cast by a streetlight or a passing car. This was a living thing, detaching itself from the fabric of the room. It flowed and writhed, coalescing into something vaguely humanoid, but elongated, distorted, and it had eyes. Two pinpricks of furious, baleful red light gleaming from the amorphous mass. Long, spindly fingers, ending in needle-sharp tips, stretched and contracted, scratching the plaster with that same dreadful sound I'd heard before. Those were the gouges. My blood ran cold, colder than the tomb breath that still swirled around me. This wasn't a dream. This was another chapter in the endless, cursed book of my life. Shane's mouth opened, not a smile anymore, but a cavernous, black maw, and from it, a voice emerged. No, voices. A chorus, a cacophony of scraping, guttural whispers and sharp, sibilant hisses, all layered beneath a chilling imitation of Shane's own voice, distorted and stretched like a broken tape. "Shh, go back to sleep, little brother." The words were an order, an incision. There was no love behind them, no warmth, no flicker of the brother who had raised me, only pure, undiluted malice, pure evil. My eyelids sagged instantly, heavy as lead, my body betrayed by my own consciousness, betrayed by him, sank back onto the mattress. I tried to fight it, clawing at the edges of the encroaching darkness, but the exhaustion was an insurmountable wave. The last thing I saw before the blackness swallowed me whole were those twin red pinpricks of light in the shadow, and Shane's malevolent grin, burning itself into the inside of my eyelids. It started, as these things always do for me, with a phone call. Most of the horrors I'd stumbled into, the whispering dead on snow-choked mountain passes, the skin-suit lady with a smile like a shattered mirror, the crawling thing in the walls that smelled like old plaster, and despair. They never bothered with introductions. They just were, but this one, this new layer of my own personal hell, began with the tinny ring of a cheap burner phone and the voice of my brother, Shane. "They're letting me out. Leo," he'd said, his voice crackling with an almost unholy excitement that had immediately set my teeth on edge. Shane, my older brother, had been a guest of the state for the past decade, 30 years to life, accessory to murder. He was a good man, or at least he had been, trapped in a shitty situation by his own desperate, misguided attempts to give us a life. But good didn't cut it in the legal system, especially not when the victim was a cop. My hand, even then, had gone to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cold steel of my watch. A nervous tick I'd picked up somewhere along the desolate highways of my existence. It usually meant I was about to hear something I didn't want to. "Early release program," he'd rushed on, barely taking a breath. "They call it ethical alteration. Says it removes your criminal tendencies. 10 minutes. Leo, 10 minutes and I'm out. We can get our lives back." My gut twisted. Ethical alteration. Even the words tasted like cheap disinfectant and institutional lies. I'd heard enough hollow promises in my life to know a trap when it wore a pretty name. "What's the catch, Shane? You sound like a damn infomercial." He'd laughed. A real laugh. One of the last I'd hear from him for a long time. "No catch, just a quick procedure. Says it's cutting-edge science. Non-invasive, no drugs, no surgery. Probably just strap me to a chair, zap my brain a little. But hey, I never had any real criminal tendencies anyway, right?" "Oh, Shane." Always so optimistic, so utterly blind to the true darkness of the world. My throat tightened. He was right about one thing. He wasn't a criminal, not in the way they meant. He was a kid who'd been dealt a rotten hand and tried to fold it into something decent. Our mother, God bless her, was a force of nature, a Category 5 hurricane of bad choices and worse men. She'd gotten pregnant with Shane at 16, kicked out, then landed with his deadbeat father who worked her raw, beat her, and then tossed her when she was pregnant with me. Shane was 12 when I arrived, a scrawny kid who'd already seen more than enough of the ugly side of life. But he'd looked at me, this tiny, helpless thing, and something in him had clicked. He became my father, my protector. He changed my diapers, figured out how to stretch $1 until Lincoln screamed, cooked me burnt toast and lumpy eggs, and held my hand on the way to school. While Mom drifted deeper into her drug-fueled haze, Shane worked. Bootleg candy from his locker, a mechanic job after school, picking up anything he could to squirrel away money. His dream wasn't for himself, it was for me, for us. A small house in the suburbs, a life where I didn't have to watch my back every time I walked down the street. In college. He wanted me to go to college, to do something important. That phrase, "do something important," became his mantra, a heavy, unspoken burden he laid on my shoulders. A burden I'd never quite managed to shake. He'd even sobered Mom up a little, just by being so damn capable. She started waiting for me after school, made dinner sometimes. It was a fragile piece, bought with Shane's sweat and sacrificed youth. And then, at 14, everything came crashing down. Shane, ever chasing that extra buck for our future fun, had taken a side gig from his boss, Mr. Franks, driving packages, not asking questions. Then one night, it was a person, a friend of Frank's, to be dropped off, waited for, and returned. Shane drove, oblivious, a rural house, gunshots. Shane, bless his naive heart, tried to leave, but the man, shot and bleeding, had clawed his way into the passenger seat, screaming at Shane to drive. Shane, seeing no other option, seeing only the money that would finally get us out of that rat-infested apartment, had driven the dying hitman to the nearest hospital, laid him on a gurney, and watched his future evaporate. The man had been an executioner. The house belonged to a detective investigating Franks. The detective and his wife were dead. The wife, bless her, had managed a 911 call before she expired. The police were on high alert. Shane, in shock, tried to explain, tried to lie, but the dead man on the gurney and the dead detective were all the evidence they needed. Franks, the snake, blamed Shane, twisting his desperation into malice, accessory to murder. 30 years. We blew every dime we had, every penny Shane had ever saved for my college, on a defense that went nowhere. The court wanted a pound of flesh, and Shane was the easiest target. I visited him religiously every few weeks, making the long, dreary drive to the state penitentiary. The walls like something out of a bad dream, smelling of stale fear and industrial cleaner. He'd try to hide it, but the marks of prison life were etched on him. The gauntness, the bruises, the way his smile, once so bright, had thinned at the edges. Still, he kept that maddening optimism. Better times are just around the corner. Leo, we'll figure it out. So when he called about the ethical alteration, it was tinged with that same desperate, hopeful naivety. It's an opportunity for us, Leo. 10 minutes, and I'm back. We can save again. You'll go to college. He hadn't called for my opinion. He'd called to tell me it was already done. The line went dead. A week passed, then another, then a third. The prison, when I called, gave me the runaround. Sick, infirmary, flu, then with a chilling nonchalance. No early release program here, sir. You must have been mistaken. My number ended up blocked. The pit in my stomach grew into a gaping chasm. I knew something was wrong. Shane never went silent. Never. Just as I was about to write a letter to anyone with a pulse in government, my phone rang. Not Shane. A curt, impersonal voice from the prison. You can pick up Mr. Thompson tomorrow at noon. He's being released on parole. No questions, no explanations. Just a stark, clinical command. My mother, for the first time in years, actually ironed a dress. Her hands shook so badly she looked like she was wrestling a ghost, but the effort was there. She even managed a few sentences that weren't a complaint or a drunken ramble. He's coming home. Leo, everything will be okay now. I just nodded, a knot of dread tightening in my chest. What had they done to him? What had convinced them a man jailed for accessory to murder was suddenly no longer a threat? The ethical alteration had stopped sounding like a bad joke and started sounding like something straight out of a particularly nasty nightmare. The prison waiting room was a sterile, unforgiving space. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, casting a sickly yellow glow on the institutional gray walls. The air smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness. I checked my watch again. Noon? Right on time. A door hissed open, and Shane emerged, flanked by two burly guards. My heart leaped, then dropped like a stone. He was different. The smile that had been his constant companion, even in the grim halls of incarceration, was gone. All the life, the animation, the sheer Shaneness of him had been meticulously scraped away. His face was vacant, his eyes staring into the middle distance as if the world in front of him was just a blurry, unimportant canvas. Shane! Oh, I called, my voice thick with a desperate hope. He turned slowly, mechanically, like a poorly programmed automaton. It was a physical reaction to the sound of his name, not the recognition of his brother's voice. I rushed forward, pulled him into a desperate hug, burying my face in the collar of his prison-issued jumpsuit. Shane, are you okay? I'm so happy to see you. You're free. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, unmoving. Shane, the man who had hugged me like a bear, who would always scoop me up in a crushing embrace, gave me nothing, not a squeeze, not a pat on the back, not even a twitch of a muscle. I pulled back, my throat suddenly dry. Shane, what the hell? Are you okay? What did they do to you? I asked, shaking his shoulders gently. Then harder, a frantic tremor running through my own body. His voice, and when it came, was flat, devoid of inflection, like a GPS instructing you to turn left. I feel okay, was the hollow echo of a voice, not the rich, warm baritone I remembered. I wanted to scream, to grab the guards by their collars and demand answers. Just then, a woman glided into the sterile waiting room. Thin, sharp, dressed in an immaculate lab coat, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, behind rimless glasses, held a predatory, almost gleeful glint. Dr. Kochik, head of the program. She introduced herself, her voice a condescending purr. Are you Shane's brother? He listed you as his post-release guardian? Yeah, I am, I snapped, my eyes blazing. What the fuck did you do to him? She didn't flinch, just regarded me with an almost scientific disinterest, as if I were a particularly noisy specimen. Your brother is one of the first individuals to undergo a revolutionary new process. It will fundamentally change the landscape of criminal justice in this country. No longer will we need to incarcerate indefinitely. We'll simply provide the alteration. You should be proud of him. Her tone dripped with an infuriating superiority. That's not my brother, I roared, pointing a trembling finger at Shane, who stood perfectly still, a blank mannequin. Shane never stood still for more than 10 seconds in his life. Look at him! He turned his head slightly when I said his name, his eyes finding me. Then Dr. Kochik, then drifting back to the empty wall. No spark, no recognition. You need to lower your voice, she said, a flicker of annoyance in her otherwise composed expression. I understand the initial effects may be shocking, but in time, you'll see he is better this way. Your brother committed a heinous crime. The effects, in any case, are irreversible. We need to discuss the path forward. Irreversible? The word tasted like ash. You don't know shit about him. He was innocent. He was a good man. Change him back. I don't care if he sits in here for the rest of his life. At least he'd be himself. My voice was hoarse, ragged. She was already ticking items off on a clipboard, barely listening. Again, the process is irreversible. Your brother signed a binding agreement to participate. He's been evaluated. Everyone is on board with Phase 2, public reintroduction. You have two options. Option 1, sign this. Take your brother home. Daily calls to me, periodic home visits. We'll help him secure employment. You will disclose nothing about this process. Any violation, he returns here. You lose all future visitation. She paused, her eyes, cold and assessing, met mine. Option 2, you don't sign. We take your brother back inside now, and you also lose all future visitation privileges. And before you start spouting off about legality or suing us, she allowed herself a small, knowing smirk. We have backing from the highest levels. Your case would go nowhere. Now, if you could hurry, please. I have several more of these to do today. Rage, pure and blinding, surged through me. So hot it nearly choked me. She was right. She held all the cards. Shane was a variable, a case study, a note on her clipboard. Not a person, but if I refused, he'd be swallowed by this place, left to rot, a blank shell in a concrete box. This blank shell was all I had left of him. It was all he had left. With a tremor, I snatched the clipboard from her manicured hand and scrawled my signature. My name a furious blur. The bitter taste of defeat was sharper than any fear I'd ever known. The drive home was a mausoleum of silence. My mother wept quietly in the passenger seat, her brief hope dissolving into the familiar despair. I tried, once or twice, to ask Shane something. Anything. How was it, Shane? What do you remember? I don't remember, he responded, each word a flat, toneless declaration, an unthinking echo, like a speaker testing its output. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Was he even still in there? Did he know who I was? Who he was? I am tired. I need sleep. The words came out of him abruptly, without preamble, the same hollow, synthesized voice. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing red eyes, a glint of chrome beneath the skin. But he was already slumped against the window, breathing slow and even, perfectly, unnervingly asleep. Just like that. Need sleep. Go to sleep. Like hitting a switch. The thought of him being some kind of cyborg, some mechanical construct, sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. My worn leather jacket felt like a straitjacket, binding me, trapping me. I needed answers. As soon as we were through the door, I'd take the metal detecting wand I kept from an old security gig and scan him. Every inch. He was still snoring softly when I parked the car outside our apartment building, the familiar grime and cracked asphalt doing little to ground me. I opened the back door, shook his shoulder gently. Usually, waking him was an act of tactical warfare, a grumpy struggle for 5 more minutes of oblivion. I braced myself, but he just opened his eyes, blinked once, and stared straight ahead. Blank. "Shane," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Hey, we're home. You can get out now. We can go inside." He just stared. I tried to sound patient. "It's okay, man. We're home." "Okay." The word was like a stone dropping into a still pond. No ripple of emotion, no current of recognition. It wasn't his voice. It was his vocal cords producing the sound. Yes, but the cadence, the inflection, the very quality of it. It was utterly alien. For 24 years, I'd known that voice. This was a crude imitation. Mom was already halfway up the stairs, a stumbling, weeping shadow. I knew she was heading for the bottle. She'd been good to me for years, after Shane had shocked her back into some semblance of motherhood. But now, without his guiding hand, she was gone, another casualty. Shane exited the car, his movements precise, unthinking. He walked directly to the elevator, hit the up button, and once inside, pressed the correct floor. When we got off, he made a beeline for our apartment door, unlocked it with the key I'd given him, and stepped through the threshold. Then, he stopped dead, stock still, like a paused video. I nearly collided with him. He seemed to be waiting for the next command. "Go sit at the kitchen table for now," I said, my voice shaking with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. "Okay." The dead voice again. I grabbed the metal detector, a flimsy plastic thing with a cheap buzzing sound, and ran it over him. His head, his chest, his limbs. Nothing. Not a single ping. I checked for scars, for stitches, for any sign of surgical invasion. His skin was smooth, unmarked. To my untrained eye, he was utterly unnervingly pristine. He endured my frantic examination without a flicker of emotion, his blank stare fixed on the wall. I could have flayed him, and he wouldn't have reacted. The thought was chilling. I sat down opposite him at the kitchen table, the cheap formica cold beneath my forearms. His eyes met mine, but it was like looking into a pair of perfectly crafted glass spheres. There was no light there, no depth, no him. Whatever essence had made Shane was gone. I was staring at an empty vessel, a collection of cells that could walk and talk, but lacked a soul. It terrified me more than any monster I'd ever encountered. Because this wasn't a monster. This was my brother's body. My voice quivered. "Shane, do you remember your full name?" "Yes." "What is it?" "Shane Theodore Thompson." A recall of data, like pulling a file from a corrupted hard drive. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." "Who am I to you?" "What is my full name?" "You are my brother, Leo Francis Thompson." A sliver of desperate hope, quickly snuffed out. This was all information they could have programmed into him, Memory dumped from his prison file. I needed something more, something personal, something only he would know. Who did you lose your virginity to, and where did it happen? The question felt crude, invasive, but I was desperate. Elise Sherman, in her parents' basement. The answer was immediate, devoid of hesitation. That memory, Shane and I had laughed about it 100 times. Elise's dad, a red-faced brute, storming down the stairs, catching them mid-act, chasing a pants around his ankles Shane out into the street in front of half the neighborhood. It was the stuff of legend, a story that always sent Shane into fits of howling laughter, his face turning beet red with embarrassment and mirth. But now, as he relayed the information, there was no humor, no flicker of a smile, no hint of the shared memory. The data was there, accessible, but disconnected from any emotion, any personal experience. He was a memory bank, not a person. They hadn't removed his criminal tendencies. They had removed him, his soul, his essence, whatever made him unique, had been ripped out, leaving behind a perfectly functional, soulless shell. My brother had died somewhere in that sterile prison, in that 10-minute procedure. For the next several weeks, I kept my end of the bargain. Called Dr. Kochik daily, gave her updates on Shane. There was nothing to report. He went to the grocery store job they'd secured for him, performing tasks perfectly, but without initiative. He ate when hungry, drank when thirsty, slept when tired. Otherwise, he just sat, blank and still, waiting for instructions. A human puppet. Dr. Kochik, for her part, was delighted. She called it a success. I called it a desecration. Shane, my vibrant, cynical, loving brother, was gone. And I, Leo Vance, the weary wanderer, was left to care for his empty husk. It was a grim, thankless burden, but it was Shane. He had sacrificed everything for me. Now, it was my turn. I would support him, this thing that wore his face, until the day one of us finally broke or died. Then, last week, everything changed. I woke around 3 REM, the familiar scratching noise pulling me from the murky depths of a stress-induced sleep. It was louder this time, more insistent, coming from the wall by Shane's bed. I rolled over, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Rats, maybe, or just my imagination. I was exhausted, bone-deep tired from the constant vigilance, the slow, agonizing grief for a brother who was still breathing, but no longer living. I closed my eyes, willing myself back to sleep. The scratching persisted. I swore under my breath. Too tired to care, I buried my head in my pillow. It would wait until morning. The next morning, however, arrived with a jolt, not from the buzzing of my alarm, but from the impossible, intoxicating smell of bacon, crispy, sizzling, undeniably real bacon. My eyes snapped open, a jolt of pure confusion running through me. Mom hadn't cooked breakfast in years, not since Shane went away, and Shane, the altered Shane, couldn't even scramble an egg without step-by-step instructions. I rolled over. Shane's bed was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. Since his return, I'd had to verbally drag him out of bed every single morning. He'd never gotten up on his own. What was happening? Then I heard it. Laughter. Shane's laughter. Rich, booming, utterly familiar. It drifted from the kitchen, mingled with my mother's lighter, almost girlish giggle, and then her voice, clear and vibrant. Speak of the devil. Leo's awake. My name. They were talking about me, bleary-eyed. I stumbled into the kitchen. Shane was at the stove, spatula in hand, a plume of bacon smoke curling around him. He turned, a wide, genuine smile splitting his face, his eyes sparkling with an animation I hadn't seen in a decade. "Morning, little brother," he boomed, abandoning the bacon to rush at me, wrapping me in a bone-crushing hug. He actually squeezed my arms, stiff with shock, barely managed to return the embrace. "We were just talking about the time you tried to bake me a birthday cake and mixed up the salt and the sugar." He pulled back, his laugh filling the small apartment, a sound I thought I'd never hear again. I was speechless. This was him. This was Shane. The genuine article. My mind raced, frantically searching for an explanation. Had the alteration worn off? Was this some delayed recovery? A miracle? I reached up, cupped his face in my hands, forcing him to meet my gaze. I stared deep into his eyes, searching for the emptiness. And there it was. Life, warmth, humor, all of Shane, shining back at me. But beneath it, lurking just at the edges of the irises, was something else. A flicker of something cold, something ancient, something unspeakably dark. A sudden, almost imperceptible flash of black, like ink blooming in clear water. I gasped, stumbling backward, tripping over my own feet. Shane laughed again, a slight edge to it now. "What's the matter, Leo? Still shocked at how much better looking I am than you?" He winked, then turned back to the sizzling bacon. "Must have been a trick of the light." "A trick of the light," I repeated, the words a hollow echo in my own mind. I wanted to believe it. God, I wanted to believe it so badly and just be happy. "Leo, be happy he's back. Maybe the effects just lessened. Maybe they wore off. Maybe..." But the coldness in his laughter, the subtle shift in his eyes, refused to be dismissed. It was there, a thin, sharp blade beneath the warmth of his returned personality. Still, we had breakfast. The best family breakfast since I was 14, and he'd been dragged away. We talked, we laughed, we reminisced. I almost cried. The sheer, overwhelming joy of having my brother truly back, battling with that insidious dread. After he left for work, I picked up the phone. "Dr. Kochik," I debated telling her. Shane's change was good, right? But something in her tone when she'd first described the irreversible alteration made me hesitate. Maybe she wouldn't see it as a good thing. Maybe she'd want to take him back. Fix him again. The phone rang twice. "Is he acting differently today?" she asked, her voice tight, anxious, before I could even get a word in. My blood ran cold. She knew. She expected it. Yeah, I stammered, my heart thudding. "Yeah, he was like his old self. Cooked breakfast? Everything. Did you notice anything strange about him?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. Urgent, frayed. "Nothing serious," I lied, the words catching in my throat. "Just his eyes looked different." "What's going on, doctor?" "Shit," she breathed, a raw, unprofessional expletive. Just hang tight. I'll come out and check on him tomorrow." And then, a click. She hung up. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She knew. She'd been expecting it. All day. I tried to act normal. Went to work, though my hands shook on the steering wheel of my truck, and the hum of the engine did little to drown out the frantic questions in my head. Would he be different tonight? Would he be the empty shell again? Or something worse? When he returned, the dread momentarily receded. He walked in, laden with grocery bags, a triumphant grin on his face. "5-star meal tonight, little brother," he announced, already heading for the kitchen. His presence, his laughter, his familiar energy, pushed back the cold fear. Maybe Dr. Kochik was just a paranoid hack. Maybe whatever she did had simply worn off, leaving Shane whole again. Maybe this was the miracle I'd secretly yearned for. If this was it, I decided. If this was my last night with my true brother before they dragged him back to that desolate place, I would savor every moment. We ate, we drank, we laughed until our sides ached, sang old songs off-key. It was a perfect night. The kind of perfect night that only happens before something truly terrible rears its head. Then, we fell asleep. I woke again around 3 Erasure a.m. The scratching had returned, louder this time. A furious, tearing sound coming from the wall directly behind Shane's bed. My eyes shot open. The cold, wet dread was back, a suffocating blanket. I pulled myself upright, scrambling backward, pressing myself into the cheap plaster of the headboard. "What the fuck?" I yelled, but the words were a useless puff of air. Shane was sitting bolt upright in his bed, just as before, feet on the floor, but the malevolent grin was wider now, a grotesque rictus illuminated by the sickly green glow of the digital clock. His eyes, in that faint light, were not the glass eyes of the altered Shane, nor the vibrant eyes of the returned Shane. They were black, truly black, like endless wells of obsidian, and I felt as if I was falling into them. "What the hell are you doing, man?" I yelped, my voice cracking. The air in the room was not just thick, it was oppressive. A physical weight on my chest, pressing me down. Breathing was a struggle, each gasp shallow and desperate. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. He didn't reply, just watched. His eyes were cold, utterly devoid of warmth or recognition. And then, movement. Behind him, on the wall, the shadow. It writhed, expanded, its outlines sharpening in the gloom. It was larger now, more defined, a hulking, skeletal thing with long, spindly fingers tipped with needle-sharp claws that gouged deep furrows in the wall, exposing the rough lath beneath. And those eyes, two furious, burning red coals, fixed on me. They weren't just gleaming, they burned, searing themselves into my retinas. Shane's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, a black, cavernous maw, and from it, a horrifying symphony of sound erupted. Not his voice, not even an imitation, a chorus of voices layered over each other, a guttural growl, a sibilant whisper, a keening wail, and a thin, high-pitched shriek, all culminating in a chilling, melodic hum that vibrated in my teeth. But beneath it all, barely discernible, was the echo of Shane's own voice, twisted and broken, like a trapped bird beating its wings against iron bars. "Shh, go back to sleep, little brother." The words weren't a suggestion. They were a command, a malevolent will wrapped around my consciousness, squeezing the fight out of me. My eyelids sagged, my limbs went heavy, leaden. I fought it, desperately. My mind screamed, "No, don't go to sleep. This isn't a dream." But the exhaustion, the terror, the sheer, crushing evil emanating from the thing that wore my brother's face overwhelmed me. My body betrayed me. I collapsed back onto the bed, the blackness swirling, pulling me down, into a sleep deeper and more terrifying than any death. I didn't wake until noon the next day. The sun, a pale, indifferent orb, streamed through the grimy windows of our apartment. My manager had left 6 missed calls and a flurry of texts, all demanding to know why I hadn't shown up for my shift. The world outside, oblivious and mundane, went on, but my world had shifted irrevocably. The events of the night before replayed in my mind, a horrifying loop of sound and shadow. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was a dream, a nightmare born of exhaustion and grief. But when I looked over at Shane's bed, the raw, undeniable evidence stared back at me. Deep, jagged gouges, 3 of them, parallel and distinct, scoring the wall behind his headboard. They looked like they'd been made by massive, clawed hands, the kind of claws a shadow with burning red eyes might possess. A cold, horrifying realization clicked into place. My blood ran colder than the tomb breath from the night. They hadn't just removed his criminal tendencies. They hadn't just removed his memories or his personality. They had removed his soul, the very essence that made Shane, Shane. ripped it clean out, leaving an empty, perfectly functional vessel, and they left it open for something else to inhabit. Dr. Kochik never showed up for her promised visit. My calls went straight to voicemail. When I contacted the prison directly, their voices were calm, infuriatingly polite. "A Dr. Kochik has never worked here, sir, and there's no record of a Shane Theodore Thompson ever serving time at this facility. They had abandoned us. They were covering it up. He's getting worse. The scratching is more frequent now, not just at night. I hear his voice, not just the alien drone, but the chorus of other voices, speaking languages I don't recognize, ancient, guttural sounds that claw at the edges of my sanity. Sometimes, when he thinks I'm not looking, I see small objects floating, hovering in the air. A teacup, a spoon. He doesn't even seem to notice, or maybe he does. I don't know how they did it, if it was some twisted science or ancient magic, but I know what they did, and I know it's not just Shane. How many others went through the process? How many others were ethically altered? How many empty vessels did they create, waiting to be filled? They didn't consider that if they removed the souls that inhabited these people, they left them open to be inhabited by something else. And now, I live with that something else, every day, waiting for it to turn its black, empty eyes on me and truly begin. Character count: 9,873 characters. The thing was the color of a swamp, slick and obscene, impossibly large, a tumor of muscle and teeth and suction cups, anchored deep in the gaping wound of what had once been a human throat. The smell of copper and something fouler, something like old rotting meat and hot iron, choked the air, so thick I could almost taste it. My hand, slick with sweat, gripped the cheap kitchen knife, the flimsy steel feeling like a child's toy against the raw, animalistic horror unfolding before my eyes. This wasn't a nightmare, it was just Tuesday, or rather the grim, blood-soaked morning after Christmas, a festive occasion made utterly grotesque by a gift nobody asked for, a monster that crawled out of wrapping paper, and a fresh stain on my already tarnished soul. God, I hated the holidays. How I arrived at this festive tableau of gore and existential dread in a dusty Melbourne rental, miles from anything resembling home, is a story for another time. The short version: a bad decision, a dead-end job, and the universe's persistent, almost whimsical, insistence on making my life a living hell. It always starts small, doesn't it? A misplaced item, a strange hum, a whisper in the dark. This time, it began with a damn present. Melbourne in late December felt less like Christmas and more like a heat stroke waiting to happen. The air was thick, humid, clinging to the skin like a damp shroud, even at night. I'd taken a short-term house-sitting gig for a couple of well-meaning but ultimately clueless expats who jetted off to Europe for a white Christmas. My job was simple: keep the plants alive, check the mail, and make sure the place didn't burn down. Easy money, or so I thought. Just another temporary port in the storm, a place to hide my head, stay off the grid, and earn enough to fuel the next leg of this endless, aimless journey. Buster, my scruffy companion, was curled up on a throw rug, his soft snores the only sound of comfort in a house that already felt too quiet. The house itself was a standard suburban brick box, full of the kind of generic furniture you find in every rental, but they'd gone all out for Christmas. A fake pine tree, dusty with age, stood awkwardly in the corner of the living room, strung with cheap tinsel and ornaments that looked like they'd been fished out of a bargain bin. On Christmas Eve, I'd tossed a few more logs onto the digital fireplace loop playing on the TV, a futile gesture against the oppressive heat, and watched as Buster chased imaginary mice in his sleep. Under the plastic branches, nestled amongst a few legitimate, unopened gifts clearly left by the owners for their returning offspring. I noticed it for the first time. It was a small package, maybe 6 inches square, wrapped in an almost offensively bright shade of green paper, topped with a perfectly symmetrical little red bow. No tag, no indication of who it was for or who it was from. My first thought, the cynical one, was that the owners had forgotten it, or it was a last-minute addition by some distant relative. It wasn't my problem. I mentally filed it under unidentified detritus and went back to wondering why I couldn't just find a quiet corner of the world where nothing bizarre ever happened. A man could dream. Christmas Day passed in a blur of lukewarm, instant coffee and the drone of a cricket match on TV. I fed Buster, walked him around the block, dodging the cheerful, sweating families. The green present remained under the tree, an island of unexplained festive cheer in the corner of my peripheral vision. I made a point of not looking at it directly. My worn leather jacket hung on a coat rack by the door, a silent sentinel, always ready. I caught myself absently checking my old analog wristwatch, tracing the cool metal with my thumb. Not for the time, never for the time. Just a habit, a grounding mechanism in a world that never stops spinning off its axis. The true horror, as it always does, began subtly, a whisper on the edge of perception. I woke up on the 26th, Boxing Day, or whatever they called it here, with that familiar taste of ash and regret in my mouth. It was just after 2 a.m., the kind of hour that felt wrong for being awake, when the world was supposed to be in a shallow, oblivious sleep. I wasn't sure what had stirred me from my fitful doze. No specific noise, no sudden jolt, just that gnawing sense of wrongness, the one that had become a constant companion since that night in Sycamore Grove, since the phantom hitchhiker and Ethan's sickening smile, since Olivia's beautiful, macabre home. My throat was dry, a desert. I slid out of the cheap bed, careful not to disturb Buster, who was still snoring softly at my feet, and shuffled toward the kitchen in my slippers. The rental was dark, thick with the silence that only a truly empty house can produce. A silence that hums with unseen things. My bare foot hit something slick on the linoleum just outside the kitchen doorway. I swore under my breath, my mind immediately conjuring spilled water, a leaky pipe, another chore for Leo Vance, the unwitting caretaker of the universe's cosmic jokes. I flicked on the kitchen light, the fluorescent hum a welcome assault on the gloom. I poured myself a glass of water from the fridge, the cold liquid a shock against my parched throat. Leaning against the counter, I stared out the window, past the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, my mind drifting to vague travel plans. Anywhere but here. Japan. Maybe. They had good coffee. When I finished the water, I set the glass in the sink and turned to hit the light switch. That's when my eyes, accustomed now to the dimness beyond the kitchen's harsh light, drifted towards the hallway leading to the living room. And that's when I froze. The Christmas tree, a pathetic monument to misplaced cheer, was still standing. But under it, the green present was no longer green. It was a vicious, violent red, a deep, arterial crimson that screamed against the dull lighting. My breath hitched. I remembered its innocent green, the perfectly tied red bow. Now, the paper seemed to bleed, to weep color. A sickly, viscous sheen coated its surface. And then I saw the trail. It was impossible to mistake. Not spilled water, not a leaky pipe. A glistening, horrifying trail of bright red. Sticky blood snaked across the cheap, off-white carpet, leading directly from the open present, a jagged tear ripping through its former pristine surface and disappearing down the hallway towards the bedrooms. My body locked up, a statue carved from pure, unadulterated dread. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn, to run, to sprint out that front door and never look back. My mind conjured the horrors I'd seen, the distorted faces in the walls, the chilling indifference of Ethan, the skin-lined rooms of Olivia's mansion. Every fiber, every instinct, save one. The one that was my damn fatal flaw. The reluctant conscience, the stubborn, self-destructive need to know, to understand, to somehow, pathetically, do something. It always dragged me deeper, like a lead weight tied to my ankle. My hand instinctively went to my worn leather jacket, not on my body, but hanging on the rack, a subconscious reach for the comfort of its weight, its familiarity. Then, the kitchen. My eyes darted to the knife block. I grabbed the largest one, a cheap chef's knife with a dull sheen, the handle slick in my sweating palm. It felt inadequate, a child's toy against whatever nightmare had just peeled itself out of that innocuous wrapping paper. But it was all I had. Buster, a few feet away, stirred. His ears twitched, his head lifted, his nostrils flaring. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound I rarely heard from him. His eyes, fixed on the hallway, were wide, dilated. He saw it too, or smelled it. "Stay," I whispered, the word a raspy cough. Buster whined, a deep, worried sound, but held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Good dog." I crept forward, each step deliberate, agonizingly slow. The knife felt heavy, then impossibly light. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. The smell grew stronger as I neared the hallway, metallic and sickly sweet, like a butcher shop in the middle of summer. My stomach churned. The blood trail was undeniable, a crimson river on the pale carpet, leading a direct path to the bedroom wing. My bedroom, my goddamn bedroom, the one where I'd left my go bag, always packed, always ready, but not ready for this. Never ready for this. I imagined the possibilities, each worse than the last. Had someone broken in? Unlikely. No signs of forced entry. Had something come within the house? More likely, given my track record. Was it waiting for me, crouched in the shadows, a grotesque parasite drawn by the scent of my lingering trauma, like a shark to blood in the water? The thought of the NDE, the cosmic farm, the sense of being a cattle for some unseen horror, flashed through my mind. This wasn't just bad luck. This was targeted. The trail led me to the open doorway of the master bedroom, the one I'd been using. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged gasp. I hesitated, frozen, my hand shaking so violently the knife trembled like a tuning fork. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run. But that damn reluctant conscience, that self-destructive spark, held me in place. What if it was still in there? What if it wasn't? What if it had already left, but left something worse behind? With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward, hand hitting the light switch in one frantic motion. The room exploded into harsh, unforgiving light. My eyes swept the space, desperate for confirmation, for anything. And then I saw it. It wasn't on the bed, not directly. It was on the floor, between the bed and the dresser, a shape, dark and glistening, a smear of impossible green-black against the pale carpet. The bed sheets, which I'd left neatly pulled back, were a mangled ruin, ripped and torn, soaked through with that same sickening red. My go bag, usually resting against the wall, was a shredded mess, its contents strewn across the floor. A ripped first aid kit, protein bars crushed under an invisible weight, a heavy Maglite flashlight bent at an unnatural angle, and the scent, the smell of ozone, of something ancient and foul, mingled with the thick, coppery reek of blood, filled my nostrils, making me gag. My gaze snapped to the thing on the floor. It was vast, slug-like, but disturbingly alien. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a smooth, dark green, almost the exact shade of the plastic Christmas tree, a horrifying mockery of festive cheer. It pulsed, a slow, sickening rhythm, like a bloated heart, and it was attached to something, to someone. My vision swam. It wasn't me. Thank God, it wasn't me. But the horror was no less profound. My eyes darted to the victim. It was the owner's cat, Whiskers, a fluffy, aloof ginger tabby that had been a silent observer of my temporary stay. The cat's small body was sprawled in an unnaturally rigid pose, its limbs splayed, twisted at angles no bone should allow. Its unseeing eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, glazed with an opaque film. Blood saturated the small rug it lay upon, soaking into the cheap fibers, a grotesque parody of a festive pattern. The creature was latched onto the cat's neck, burrowed in, its head, bulbous and veined, had torn open the feline's throat and was sunk deep into the exposed wound. As I stared, transfixed by a horror so absolute it stole my breath, I saw the thing writhe, a slow, undulating movement as it fed. Its body, leech-like, seemed to swell even as I watched, distending, growing fatter on the lifeblood of the small creature. This wasn't just a parasite, it was an engine of consumption, a maw of pure, unadulterated hunger. A cursed minute stretched into an eternity. My mind screamed, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move, couldn't even tear my eyes away from the repulsive sight. This thing, this grotesque mockery of life, felt profoundly wrong. A violation of the natural order so absolute it made the skin-wearing horror of Olivia's mansion seem almost quaint. It was a tangible piece of the cosmic indifference I'd glimpsed in that chilling vision of the farm. A reminder that the universe wasn't just unfeeling, but actively, malevolently hungry. Finally, the sheer, visceral revulsion broke the spell. I stumbled backward, the cheap kitchen knife clattering to the floor with a pathetic sound. I didn't care. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that thing. I scrambled out of the bedroom, tripping over Buster, who had followed me, whining, his hackles raised. He was whimpering now, a low, terrified sound, his tail tucked tight between his legs. Good boy. At least one of us still had a working flight instinct. I knew Whiskers was dead. There was no doubt. The sight, the smell, the impossible unnaturalness of it all, it carved itself into my mind. Another layer of scar tissue over a soul already flayed raw. I should call the police. That was the logical next step. But my mind, reeling from the shock, from the primal horror, could only fixate on one thing: the present, the source. I had to see it again, had to understand. I staggered back into the living room, my legs unsteady, my breath catching in my throat. The Christmas tree seemed to mock me, its pathetic lights twinkling with sinister cheer. The box, what remained of it, was a mess. The bright red wrapping paper, which I now realized had been green just yesterday, was not just stained, but thoroughly logged through with blood, a gruesome pulp. The top of the box had been savagely ripped off, a gaping maw in the cardboard, as if the creature had burst forth in a frenzy. I knelt, my knees protesting on the stained carpet, and stared into the ruined box. The stench of blood was overwhelming now, coupled with that strange, fetid odor from the creature. Inside, half submerged in the clotted, crimson mess, was something I couldn't immediately identify. A mangled piece of meat. It was shapeless, grayish, mottled with darker patches. The police, when they finally came, would later identify it as a dismembered human hand. Most likely, a grotesque provision, food for the creature, sealed in with it, a perverse Christmas dinner for the hungry horror within. But my gaze fixed on something else, something small, miraculously unstained by the gore. A scrap of white paper, barely an inch square, sitting perfectly pristine on the bloody pulp. My hand, still trembling, reached for it. My fingers, slick with sweat and something else, carefully pinched the edges. I pulled it free, holding it up to the dim light of the living room. The words were written in impeccable cursive, elegant loops and flourishes. A stark, chilling contrast to the butchery around me. This is the gift that awaits everyone on the naughty list. Let it be a warning to you all. Cole is hungry, and he will feed. Merry Christmas. SC. My breath hitched, my heart pounded, not just from fear, but from a cold, creeping certainty. C. Not Santa Claus, not a prank. No, the cosmic dread I'd felt, the sense of being watched, judged, selected. The things I'd seen, the impossible horrors I'd survived, the constant flight from a past I couldn't remember, but felt in my bones. It wasn't random, it was a damn judgment. Cole is hungry, and he will feed. The creature, then, the thing that had just drained a cat dry, it wasn't just a monster, it was an instrument. And the gift, it hadn't been misplaced, it had been delivered to me. A perverse present for Leo Vance, the man forever on the naughty list. The implications settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My past, the one I couldn't recall, the one that made me a magnet for this horror, was catching up. The curse of Sycamore Grove wasn't just a memory, it was an active, malevolent force, meticulously tracking me, delivering me a personalized message from the void. Every step I took, every temporary job, every nameless town I hid in was just delaying the inevitable. I wasn't running from my past. My past was simply taking its time, enjoying the hunt. I looked at the crumpled note in my hand, then at the shredded go bag, the bent flashlight, my tools for survival, rendered useless, just like me. I felt a cold, bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, choked off before it could escape. Merry Christmas, indeed. Buster whined, nosing my hand. I looked at him, his scared, trusting eyes. He was the one thing, the only thing, that tethered me to anything resembling decency. And now, he was here, with me, on the naughty list. The reluctant conscience, or my fatal flaw, twisted in my gut. I had to get us out. But where? Where do you run when you're being hunted by a cosmic delivery service? When the universe itself is sending you a present? The answer, I realized with a chilling certainty, was nowhere. There was no escape, not in this life, and certainly not beyond it. The farm was waiting, and so was Cole. Total characters, 9:45. The air crackled, not with static electricity, but with something far fouler. A smell like ozone and burnt plastic clawed at my throat, stinging my eyes, and then Edward's face, a distorted, pixelated caricature of the man I used to know, stretched and contorted, pushed through the shimmering surface of my laptop screen. His eyes, twin white voids, stared, not at the screen itself, but through it directly into mine, locking me in a gaze that felt impossibly cold. A grotesque, sickening pop echoed in the small room, the sound of impossible pressure being released, and then a hand, elongated and twitching, covered in the green-blue glow of the monitor, clawed its way out. The sheer, physical impossibility of it brought a cold, numbing terror that froze the breath in my lungs. It was an obscenity, a violation of reality itself, and it was reaching for me, a digital wraith becoming flesh right before my eyes. It hadn't always been like this. Before the pixels turned to pseudo-flesh, before the screen became a gateway to a digital hell, there was just the unsettling quiet of a life lived on the fringes, and the familiar, nagging feeling that I should have known better. It always started with a feeling, a subtle wrongness, a whisper of a lie that humanity, in its infinite hubris, had decided to call progress. This time, it began with a dead man's online ghost and my own goddamn cursed curiosity. My life, as it often was, had been a series of temporary landscapes and disposable jobs. A few months ago, I'd been stuck on the night shift at a data archiving facility outside of Fargo, a mausoleum of blinking lights and humming servers, where the air was always too cold and smelled faintly of ozone and regret. That's where I'd met Edward, Not a friend, not a colleague in any meaningful sense. Just a presence. He was the kind of guy who didn't just understand technology, he seemed to believe he could commune with it. Wiry, intense, with eyes that saw something beyond the physical. Even then, he'd wear those thick-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, always hunched over a console, muttering to himself about gray code and the etheric layer of the internet. Claims that most of the crew dismissed as the usual tech bro eccentricity, just a little more unhinged than average. I, on the other hand, had seen enough unhinged to recognize a different flavor when it presented itself. Edward was obsessed with the human consciousness. Not AI, he'd corrected me once. A flicker of something dark in his eyes when I dared to use the term. AI is an imitation, he'd said, leaning too close, smelling faintly of stale coffee and something metallic, like burnt circuitry. The true future is ascension, uploading the very soul. I just grunted, probably adjusting my worn leather jacket, trying to keep my expression neutral. I wasn't interested in his philosophy. My philosophy revolved around getting through the shift without incident, getting paid, and getting out of town before anything stuck. But Edward, like a particularly persistent burr, seemed to have decided I was a captive audience. He'd corner me by the coffee machine, by the vending machines, even in the dead, echoing silence of the server rows, ranting about quantum entanglement and digital immortality. He'd pull out diagrams that looked like occult symbols rendered in circuit board patterns. I'd nod, feign interest, check my old analog wristwatch out of habit, willing him to finish. He just wanted someone to listen, someone to acknowledge his genius. My fatal flaw, I suppose, is that I often let my guard down just enough to be polite. I never did anything to provoke him, never challenged his theories, just politely dismissed his invitations to join his research. Maybe that was enough. My quiet disinterest, my inherent skepticism, perhaps even my mere survival, was an affront to him. Edward died 3 months after I left that job, electrocuted in his garage, the news report said, found amidst a tangle of wires, custom-built hardware, and scorched circuit boards. An unfortunate accident, they'd called it. I remember thinking, figures. You play with fire, you get burned, or in his case, fried. A grim end for a grim man. I'd packed up my 2 duffel bags, one for clothes, one the go bag, cash, flashlight, protein bars, water, a basic first aid kit, and driven west, finding myself in a nondescript apartment in a nondescript town, working nights at a shipping depot. For a couple of weeks, the silence was almost deafening. The kind of silence that usually preceded something truly awful. Then the messages started. The first one was a comment on a photo I'd posted to a burner social media account, a mundane shot of a sunset over a distant mountain range. It was a fake name, a throwaway account, almost 0 followers. That was the point of it, anonymity. The comment simply read, "Nice sunset, Vance, still chasing horizons?" My blood ran cold. Edward's profile picture too, grinning out at me. I'd blocked the account years ago. Instagram's security was, in my experience, annoyingly effective. It shouldn't have been possible. I immediately assumed someone had hacked Edward's account, or that it was a sick joke from one of his equally unhinged relatives. Ryan, Edward's cousin, always had a sadistic streak. I reported it. The account was suspended. Good. Problem solved. Or so I told myself. Except it wasn't. The comments, always from Edward's defunct account, always with his pixelated grin for a profile picture, began appearing on other platforms. A dead man's digital ghost. My throwaway email started receiving strange attachments. Not spam, but code. Cryptic, alien strings of symbols that looked less like programming and more like a fever dream. Each email, a single subject line. Remember gray code? My old, battered Nokia flip phone, which I use for emergencies and nothing else, started receiving empty calls, sometimes just a burst of white noise, sometimes a high-pitched whine that grated on my teeth. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, usually a creature of calm, stoic devotion, started getting antsy. He'd follow me from room to room, his nose twitching, his low growl a constant undercurrent to the artificial hum of the cheap apartment. He'd fixate on the modem's blinking lights or the TV screen when it was off, whining softly. Animals see things. I've learned things we're too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. I was afraid. All right. This was different from the whispers in the old house, different from the chill that followed the hitchhiker, different from the unnatural warmth of a certain skin collector's parlor. But it was the same underlying wrongness. It was like the world was peeling back another layer, showing me another brand of teeth, a digital one this time. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Someone with a vendetta, someone with too much time and too many technical skills. Police were useless. Cyber harassment, they called it, scribbling on their notepads, their eyes glazing over the moment I mentioned dead men in gray code. "We'll investigate," they'd mumbled, sending me off with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. My faith in institutions was already at an all-time low. This just hammered the last nail into that particular coffin. A week ago, I found myself lying in bed, Buster curled at my feet, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The cheap digital clock on the bedside table glowed, 2:17 a.m. I'd been tossing and turning, my mind refusing to quiet down. The night was a heavy blanket of silence, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the murmur of the old building settling. And then, a sudden ping, a jolt through the quiet. My laptop, sitting open on my desk across the room, less than a foot from the end of my bed, had flared to life. The screen, a pale blue rectangle in the gloom, hummed. I hadn't left it on. Hell, I hadn't even left it switched on. My stomach tightened, a familiar coil of dread. Buster stirred, a low, rumbling growl starting in his chest. His ears were flat against his head, pointed at the laptop, a dark silhouette against the faint glow. The screen scrolled, silently, slowly. It wasn't my desktop. It wasn't even my browser homepage. It was Edward's profile on Facebook. Who the hell still uses Facebook? It was like a digital mausoleum, a relic from a forgotten past. This was a whole new level of intrusion. My fingers twitched, itching for the baseball bat I kept tucked under the bed. Even though I knew it was useless against whatever this was, a hacker, it had to be a hacker. Ryan, probably, trying to scare me. Or worse, trying to blame me for Edward's stupidity. The scrolling stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I was staring at an old photo, Edward and I, at a work gathering years ago. It was from the early days, before his darkness had fully shown itself, before his ambition had curdled into something monstrous. We looked normal, almost happy. A lie. It was always a lie. "All right, Ryan," I murmured, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet room. Buster whined, and pressing closer to my leg. "You've made your point. It's my fault he's dead. Just cut the crap already." Then the photo moved. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Buster let out a sharp, anxious bark, then whimpered. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were glued to the screen. I and everything else in the picture remained perfectly still, frozen in a moment that was long dead. But Edward moved, his head tilted, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. Then he detached himself from the background, a subtle shimmer around his edges, and began to walk. No, not walk, glide. He glided over to the photographer, his pixelated form growing larger and larger, expanding, engulfing every square inch of the full-screen image until his face, now horribly close, filled the entire monitor. My dead acquaintance, Edward, was staring through the laptop screen, staring at me. The white, soulless eyes were already there, even in that old photograph. I just hadn't seen them then. I'd been too busy trying to ignore the truth. "What the hell is this?" I breathed, my voice thin and reedy. This wasn't some deep fake. This wasn't Ryan's twisted sense of humor. This was impossible. My mind raced, clawing for a rational explanation. A video embedded in an image? No, that wasn't how it worked. Not like this, not that fluid, that organic, that wrong. And then his voice. "Hello, Vance," Edward said. His voice was a mangled echo, as if someone had recorded it, then run it through a meat grinder. It was garbled, crackling like static on an old radio, yet undeniably his. My chest tightened, a cold knot of dread. Had he recorded himself to torture me from beyond the grave? Was this some elaborate, posthumous, digital trap? "You look, well," his inhuman voice gushed, the words dripping with something slimy, something that made my skin crawl. "I like your new routine, the late nights. Very efficient." He knew my habits. He knew my name, my burner accounts, my location. He'd been watching, always watching. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Buster was growling steadily now, a low, continuous sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Edward's demeanor shifted, mirroring the man I'd briefly known. The charming facade, always thin, always brittle, began to crack. His pixelated head tilted even further to one side, a grotesque parody of curiosity. His smile, which had been stretched unnaturally wide, now tightened, brimming with pure malignancy. The dead man's charm, if it could ever be called that, vanished. His pupils, too, were fading, diluting into the sickly white of his irises. Seconds later, all that remained were two blank, empty, milky spheres, like scarred-over wounds. It was as if I were seeing the real Edward at long last, the subhuman thing that had lain dormant beneath his thin shell of intellect and ambition. A thunderous, thudding sound sent a shockwave through my body, vibrating the floorboards. It was a sickening, squelching sound, like something wet being pushed through something tight. Horrified, I watched Edward's hands pressing against the shimmering screen of my laptop. Not just his hands, his whole body. He was pushing, as if he were trapped underwater, struggling against a surface that rippled and distorted with every effort. The screen continued to flex inward, bending, bowing, creaking with a sound that wasn't right, a sound that wasn't possible for electronics. It was the sound of something alive, something struggling. My breath hitched. A guttural scream tore itself from my throat, raw and desperate. I finally accepted it. This wasn't Ryan. This wasn't any digital prank. This wasn't anything that could be explained by earthly rhyme or reason. This was the same brand of impossible horror I'd been running from my entire adult life, just manifesting in a new, technologically advanced form. I wasn't going to wait for my undead abuser. Never again. Not after all I'd seen. Not after all I'd run from. Not after the Sycamore Grove incident, which still clawed at the edges of my memory like a phantom limb. I scarpered from my bed, Buster barking frantically at my heels, beelining for the door of my room. My go bag was right beside it. Just get out. That was the mantra. Just survive. Before I could reach the door, a blinding flash of light erupted from my laptop screen. It was so intense it burned pinpricks into my vision. The door, which I'd left ajar, swung shut with a violent slam, shaking the thin walls. A piercing sound, like a ghastly cry of agony, emitted from the speakers of my laptop. It was Edward's voice, amplified, distorted, a shriek of digital pain that made my teeth ache. "You're not leaving me again, Vance," Edward's mangled voice commanded, rattling the very air. I rotated slowly, my eyes still watering from the flash, to face the digital entity that was slithering free from my laptop screen. The screen itself was stretching around him like elasticated rubber, clinging to his grotesque form as if unwilling to let him go. The thin bezel of the laptop frame groaned under the impossible pressure. When he finally escaped his digital prison, Edward's long limbs, still glowing with the sickly blue-green luminescence of the screen, glitched ghoulishly before me. His arms twitched, his legs buckled, his body seemed to flicker, like a bad connection, before solidifying, becoming more substantial with every agonizing second. He adjusted his posture, the sounds of his movements like 1,000 tiny tearing sounds, standing upright and gazing upon me with those horrible, white, empty eyes. My stalking specter widened his fiendish, Cheshire cat grin. "I found a way to live forever," he whispered, his voice still ragged, but gaining strength, becoming more human, more insidious. "If you join me, Vance, I promise we won't ever fight again. We can be infinite." Buster was a fury of barks and growls, a small, courageous bundle of rage, trying to get between me and the nightmare. I tried the door again, furiously twisting the handle, rattling it. It was being held shut by an invisible, unyielding force, as if bolted from the other side. Twisting my head to look at the monstrous creature behind me, I whimpered, a sound I hated, a sound of absolute terror. Edward slowly stumbled towards me on unsteady, glitching legs, toppling his head to one side, a chilling echo of his old mannerisms. I screeched at the top of my lungs, a primal, animal sound, and turned back to face the door, desperately yanking the handle, trying to rip it from its hinges. That was when I had a dreadful idea, a stupid idea, a suicidal idea. But it was an idea. I darted towards my bedside table, swerving past Edward's outstretched, flickering arms. His reach was impossible, extending unnaturally as I moved, a visual distortion of space. Buster yelped, startled, but stayed right on my heels, snapping at the air around Edward's legs. My hand closed around a half-full glass of water, left there hours earlier. The plastic felt slick in my sweating palm. I turned to face my ex-acquaintance, my former tormentor, now something else entirely, something alien. His lips parted, and a pit of blackness was revealed within his mouth, a vacuum of pixels. That same high-pitched wail erupted from the caverns of his demonic body, the sound of 1,000 dial-up modems screaming in agony, a sound meant to shatter eardrums. He knew what I was about to do, knew it from the look in my eyes, the desperation in my stance. Without a moment's thought, a primal surge of self-preservation overriding every ounce of rational fear. I launched the glass of water at the digital ghoul that was lumbering towards me. It spun end over end, a slow-motion arc of shimmering water molecules. The plastic tumbler, cheap and flimsy, hit Edward square in the chest. Water exploded across his shimmering, translucent skin, soaking his flickering form. Edward screamed, not the digital wail from the speakers, but a robotic cry so deafeningly loud, so utterly devoid of humanity, that my ears popped, a sharp, painful pressure. His eyes, those milky white voids, widened into perfect circles of pure horror. As the water soaked through his unnaturally glowing form, he began to spasm manically, his body glitching and contorting with violent, uncontrolled jerks. He shuddered, his unbound digital form retreated, dissolving back into the shimmering, rippling effect of the screen. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the laptop screen reclaimed him, pulling him back into its confines, the digital surface bubbling and churning as he was sucked in, pixel by pixel, limb by limb. The last thing I saw was his wide, white eyes, burning with furious, frustrated malice, before the screen snapped back to normal, displaying a generic login page. A faint wisp of something that smelled like ozone and burnt toast lingered in the air. My bedroom door swung open with a creak, as if the invisible force that had held it shut had suddenly dissipated, its concentration broken. I didn't hesitate. Buster was already halfway out. I seized my opportunity, my go bag already in hand, and fled my flat, leaving the laptop, the lingering smell, and the fresh layer of trauma behind. I have been living in my car for the past few days, moving from one anonymous town to the next, sleeping in the back seat. Buster curled tightly against me. The cheap motel rooms feel too vulnerable now. Too much technology, too many outlets. This is the first time I've used any substantial technology since the incident. Huddled in a corner booth of an all-night computer cafe, its fluorescent lights humming, the air thick with stale coffee and desperation. There are plenty of people around, a comfortable hum of chatter and keyboard clacks, and I don't think Edward would be stupid enough to come for me in a public place. But who knows, what's stupid to a thing that can pull itself from a screen? I just needed to write this down, to get it out of my head before it completely consumed me. I keep seeing flickering screens out of the corner of my eye. Every phone, every tablet, every glowing billboard feels like a threat, a potential window for him to peer through, to push through. Every reflection is suspect. Should I just get off the grid entirely? Melt into the wilderness? Avoid technology for the rest of my life? I can't run. He's everywhere now. He is the ghost in the machine, and he knows my name. Character count 9,784. My lungs burned, a raw, screaming fire in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with pure, unadulterated terror. The old leather jacket I wore felt like a lead blanket, soaked through with sweat that wasn't from a summer sprint, but from the icy dread that had clamped onto my spine. Behind me, the apartment door groaned on its hinges, a sound like a dying animal, and I knew what was coming next. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, guttural snarl, a sound that would forever be seared into my brain, louder and more monstrous than anything a human throat should be able to produce. My hand, slick with something I didn't want to think about, instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the worn metal of my analog watch. No time, never enough time, just the sickening throb of my heart against my ribs, each beat a drum of impending doom. I knew this feeling, the gut-wrenching certainty that the world had spun off its axis, plunging me headfirst into another nightmare. My legs were moving, mechanical and unthinking, carrying me away from the chaos I'd just unleashed, away from harmony, or rather, away from whatever harmony had become. This wasn't the first time I'd run, and if my luck held, it wouldn't be the last. But this time felt different, more personal, more inevitable. It felt like running from a piece of myself. The storm inside me had been brewing for months, long before the raw meat and the guttural snarls. It had started with the breakup, an act that was anything but liberating. Despite what the self-help gurus might preach, I'd be lying if I said ending things with harmony felt like freedom. Instead, it was a volatile mix of guilt and relief, clashing in a violent whirlpool that threatened to drag me under. Had I done enough? Was leaving her selfish? Or was it the only way to preserve what little sanity I had left? Her tears, those pleading words that echoed like tiny, sharp knives in my head, and my own crushing sense of failure. They clung to me like a shroud. Every moment afterward felt like dragging chains through a dense, suffocating fog. It was the kind of agonizing decision that felt like putting a puppy down behind a woodshed, a helpless, soul-crushing act that you knew, with a morbid certainty, had to be done. Harmony didn't need a boyfriend. She needed therapy. Or perhaps, I realize now, an exorcism. My bad luck, as always, chose the latter for her. We'd met in our 20s, a chance encounter that felt like fate at the time, though now I recognized it as another thread in the tapestry of my cursed existence. She was beautiful in a fragile, haunted way. Big, dark eyes that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken sadness, a wisp of a smile that rarely reached them. Her past, a broken record she played often, was a litany of abandonment. Mother overdosed, father vanished. She'd bounced through foster care, a leaf adrift, clinging to anyone who offered the barest semblance of stability. And when she clung, she did so with a desperation that was both heartbreaking and utterly suffocating. My phone, a cheap, indestructible burner I used for my transient jobs, became a vibrating extension of her anxiety. Hundreds of texts would pile up in a single day, each one a desperate plea for reassurance. You're not mad, right? You're not leaving. If I didn't respond with the speed of a seasoned hostage negotiator, she'd spiral. The phone would ring incessantly, her voice frantic, tearful, barely coherent. "Why are you ignoring me?" she'd cry, the sound a dull ache in my chest, stabbing at whatever resolve I tried to muster. Each confrontation, each attempt to reason with her, left me drained, a mix of guilt and helpless frustration tightening in my chest. The cycle would repeat endlessly until I felt like a dry sponge, wrung out and brittle. Her texts, her insatiable need for constant validation, her melodramatic meltdowns whenever I so much as glanced at someone else, it wore me down, eroded me piece by piece. But I stayed, a fool playing hero, convinced I could save her. I should have known better. My past taught me that I can barely save myself, let alone anyone else. It's a cruel joke, my reluctant conscience always dragging me into the fire, like that poor hitchhiker screaming into the snow-choked night, or the way I tried to help Mitch, only to find an imposter staring back. I failed them, just as I failed Harmony. It's my fatal flaw, this misguided sense of responsibility. Months after the breakup, a deceptive calm settled over my life, a silence so profound it felt unnatural. I was on a night shift at a warehouse, the endless drone of forklifts and the smell of cardboard my new companions. Then Harmony resurfaced. Her texts, once a relentless torrent, became sporadic, almost cheerful. She shared snippets of a new life, photos from hiking trails, her pale complexion now kissed with sunlight, a faint, almost ethereal glow replacing the shadows that had once clung to her like a second skin. My cynical brain tried to find the flaw, the crack in the veneer. Was it a new addiction? A cult? My experience with Olivia, the skin carpet lady, taught me that beauty could be a meticulously crafted lie, a trap baited with illusion. Even Ethan, for all his charm, had a monstrous hunger beneath the surface. This sudden, inexplicable shift in Harmony felt equally off. One picture stood out, Harmony beaming on a cliffside, an expanse of trees and sky behind her. 5 km, new personal best, she'd written, her smile wide, almost too wide. Even then, I stared at the screen, a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in my stomach. Pride warred with a deep-seated skepticism that felt like a permanent resident in my soul. "Badass," I texted back, the word feeling hollow, almost sarcastic, even as I typed it. Her reply was immediate, a flurry of bubbles popping up on the screen. "Got lost on the way back. Spooked me a bit, but I'm fine." Lost. The word resonated with a chilling echo. I'd been lost too, in those endless, featureless roads, stalked by things that shouldn't exist, the phantom whispers, the feeling of being watched from the shadows. It was always the woods, wasn't it? The dark, ancient places where the rules of the world bent and broke. That night, she messaged again, feeling dizzy. Maybe something bit me on the hike. A sharp pang of concern, an unwanted guest, tightened its grip on my chest. Damn my conscience. "You should get it checked out," I urged, the words a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived vulnerability. "I will," she promised. But promises from Harmony rarely held water. Hours later, her follow-up message arrived. A single line that grated on my nerves. "Doc says I'm fine, just need rest." Just need rest. I almost laughed, a dry, humorless rasp that would have surprised anyone who heard it. Rest never solved anything. It just gave the darkness time to fester, to grow. But rest didn't seem to help. Over the following week, Harmony's messages devolved from strange to genuinely unsettling. She described vivid, inescapable dreams of being chased through dense woods. The trees themselves whispering her name, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for her. "It's probably just stress," I'd replied. A hollow platitude I didn't believe for a second, though her words lingered in my mind, a sour taste on my tongue. The photos she sent began to change too. Subtly at first, then with an increasing, horrifying clarity. Her skin, which had seemed so healthy and glowing just days before, now appeared paler, almost translucent, as if the light were passing through it rather than reflecting off it. Her eyes, once alight with a fragile, newfound confidence, now carried a shadowed intensity, a depth that felt alien, predatory. In one photo, her smile, the one that had been too wide before, seemed strained, a rictus, as if something beneath the surface were struggling to break free, or perhaps to remain hidden. It reminded me of the mirror doppelganger, how a familiar face could hide an abyssal, unspeakable wrongness. The world was a canvas for these twisted illusions, and I was perpetually stuck in the gallery, forced to observe. Then came the phone call, late on a Tuesday night. I was halfway through a cold can of generic beer, staring at the flicker of a static-filled TV. Her voice was low, trembling, a raw nerve. "Leo," she whispered, and my name, coming from her, sounded wrong, hollowed out. "I don't feel right. I keep hearing things at night. Footsteps outside my window, scratching at my door." A shiver, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, crept down my spine. The image of the man on the walls, his presence a silent threat behind the drywall, flashed through my mind. This was the same insidious invasion, the violation of sanctuary. "Do you want me to come over?" I asked, already reaching for my keys, cursing my damnably inconvenient conscience. Every fiber of my being screamed no, but the words came out anyway, a reflex I couldn't seem to unlearn. "No," she replied, or too quickly. The words sharp, final. I don't want you to see me like this." Her refusal only deepened my unease, twisting it into a tight knot of dread. This wasn't the Harmony I knew, the one who craved constant validation, who would have begged me to come. This was something new, something chilling. That night, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone in her dimly lit apartment, clutching her phone with trembling hands as shadows, literal or otherwise, closed in around her. Something was profoundly wrong, and though I couldn't explain it, I knew the Harmony I once knew was slipping away, replaced by something else. This was becoming a pattern. Something always slipped away. My family, my memories, my hope. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly on the cheap nightstand beside my futon. It was a relentless vibration, a physical manifestation of my growing dread. I squinted at the screen through the gloom of my apartment. 19 missed calls, dozens of texts, a rapid-fire sequence of increasingly disturbing fragments. "I don't remember last night. There's blood. Leo, I'm scared." Panic, cold and sharp, overtook me. It was a familiar sensation, a constant companion on this long, strange journey. This was the kind of panic that burrowed deep, bypassing the cynical logic circuits and going straight for the primal fear. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, to pack the go bag and disappear into the anonymity of the highway, I found myself pulling on my worn leather jacket, the old analog watch still ticking dutifully on my wrist, and rushing out the door. My reluctant conscience, it seemed, was determined to lead me to my grave. Her apartment building stood silent, a monolithic tombstone against the gray morning sky. I took the stairs two at a time, my boots echoing hollowly in the deserted stairwell. The silence in the hallway outside her door was the first thing that truly hit me. An oppressive quiet that hung heavy in the air, thick and cloying, like dust motes suspended in a sunbeam, but somehow more sinister. My hand hesitated over the doorknob, the cool metal feeling like a promise of something terrible. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was waiting for me inside wouldn't be good. It never was. The door, somehow unlocked, creaked open with a groan that seemed to scrape against my eardrums, revealing a scene that looked like it had been ripped from the darkest corners of a nightmare. The living room was a carnival of chaos, furniture overturned, splintered wood and shattered glass glittering malevolently on the floor like scattered jewels. And then the blood, not just a few drops, but streaks and smears. Dark, viscous handprints streaked across the walls in erratic, desperate patterns, as if someone had been trying to escape. Clawing at the very structure of the room, the metallic tang of it hung heavy in the air, a visceral assault on my senses. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute. This was a slaughterhouse masquerading as a living room. Harmony sat hunched on the couch, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, rocking back and forth with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Her pale hands were clutched in her hair, pulling at the strands as if trying to rip away the memory of the night. Her eyes, shadowed and wide, darted to mine as I entered, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Fear, recognition, passing through them. "Leo," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy tremble, barely audible above the ringing in my ears. I don't know what happened." "What do you mean you don't know?" My voice was rough, choked with a mix of horror and disbelief. I gestured wildly to the surrounding chaos, the shattered remnants of what had once been her life. "Look at this place. Whose blood is this?" She shook her head violently, a rapid, almost animalistic movement, tears streaming down her face, carving paths through the grime and dried blood smeared there. "I don't know. I don't remember anything after I got home last night." Her voice cracked, raw with fear, but there was something else beneath it, something cold and distant that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I hesitated, my eyes scanning the room again, my gaze lingering on the blood. It was too much for a minor injury. And the handprints, they were too large, the fingers thick and splayed. They weren't hers. A cold, sinking feeling coiled in my stomach, like a serpent waking from a long slumber. My mind, ever the survivor, pieced together the impossible. "Harmony," I said carefully, kneeling in front of her, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Who else was here?" Her gaze turned distant, unfocused, as if she were looking through me, or perhaps into some other, unseen dimension. Her breathing quickened, shallow and rapid, like a bird caught in a snare. "There was someone," she said, barely audible, her words a breathy rasp. I think they were in the woods. I saw them, but I don't remember their face. They followed me home, didn't they?" A profound chill, a bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the apartment's temperature, ran down my spine as her words finally sank in. "Followed me home." The air in the apartment felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on me. My instinct, honed by years of running from things that defied explanation, screamed at me to get out, to grab her and drag her out of this madness, to leave this place behind and never look back. But I couldn't move, rooted to the spot, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to ask. Questions I knew, deep down, I didn't want the answers to. It felt like standing on the edge of a void, peering into the abyss. and sensing something ancient and hungry staring back. "We need to get you out of here," I said finally, my voice firmer than I felt, a desperate attempt to impose some semblance of order on the encroaching chaos. She nodded, her movements stiff and robotic, as if fear had taken physical control of her body, turning her into a puppet. Whatever had happened here, whatever she'd seen, or whatever had done this, was far from over. This was just the prologue. My gut told me that. My gut was never wrong. I brought her to my apartment, a sterile, temporary sanctuary, hoping to keep her safe, to shield her from whatever had marked her. It was a foolish, utterly Vance-like thing to do. My go bag was already packed, waiting by the door, a silent testament to my usual modus operandi. Flee, don't engage. But I had engaged, and now I was paying for it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside the window, setting my teeth on edge. Around 3 a.m., the familiar prickle of dread returned, raising the hairs on my neck. I opened my eyes, staring into the oppressive darkness of my small bedroom. Harmony's bed, the futon I'd given her, was empty. The window above it stood open, letting in the damp night air. A cold knot formed in my stomach. No. 2 hours later, as the first gray light of dawn was painting the sky, a faint rustling sound reached my ears. She reappeared, slipping under the covers as if she'd never left. Her movements fluid and silent as a predator. Her hands, I noticed in the faint light filtering through the blinds, were smeared with something dark, something that glinted wetly. It wasn't blood, not exactly, but it had that unsettling sheen. She claimed it was nothing, a smudge, but the lies in her eyes screamed otherwise. A new, unsettling depth replacing the old fear. It was the same look I'd seen in the eyes of the thing that wore Mitch's face. The calm, unnerving certainty of a predator. The next day, she cooked dinner, or rather, she laid out dinner. A platter of raw, unseasoned steak, glistening under the dim kitchen light, its deep red color almost black in places. The smell was cloying, metallic. I stared at it, a wave of nausea washing over me. "You've been acting weird," I finally managed, my voice strained, my stomach doing acrobatic flips. Her head tilted, a strange, almost bird-like movement that was completely unlike the Harmony I knew. Her eyes, those deep, shadowed pools fixed on me, unblinking. "Weird," she purred, the sound too low, too resonant for her petite frame. "I feel better than ever." Her smile, that too wide, rictus grin, stretched further, revealing teeth that seemed a little too sharp, a little too long. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, thick with an unspoken threat. It was a smile that promised something ancient and hungry, like the gods of the NDE, feasting on humanity. My patience, stretched thin by weeks of creeping dread, finally snapped. "The blood, Harmony," I said, pushing the plate of raw meat away, the sickening smell making my gorge rise. "Your disappearances, the way you're looking at me right now." "What the hell is going on?" Her calm shattered like glass. Her rage erupted, instantaneous and terrifying, animalistic and feral, a primeval force. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had shed its human skin and revealed its true monstrous form. She lunged, a sudden, impossible burst of speed. Her hands, those large, strong hands, reaching for my throat, my reflexes, honed by years of surviving the impossible, kicked in. My hand shot out, grabbing for the only weapon within reach, the long, sharp kitchen knife I'd used to cut up what I thought was dinner. The cool steel felt solid, comforting, in my trembling grasp. I brought it up, a desperate, clumsy thrust aimed at her center. The blade sank into her stomach with a sickening squelch, but she didn't stop. There was no cry of pain, No human reaction, just that guttural snarl, deepening, becoming more demonic. Her eyes, burning with an unholy light, locked onto mine, and I saw not harmony, but something ancient and ravenous. She didn't recoil. Instead, she laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and pulled the blade out with a wet, sucking sound, as if it were nothing more than a splinter. The wound, a gaping maw in her abdomen, seemed to ripple, to close, like water disturbed by a stone. No, not like water, like flesh, unnaturally. That was my cue. I fled, my heart pounding so fiercely it felt as if it might burst. My breath ragged and shallow, the metallic scent of fresh blood filling my nostrils. My legs carried me blindly through the dimly lit hallway of my own apartment, stumbling over my own feet, my mind replaying her monstrous snarls, the impossible sight of the healing wound, and the haunting, inhuman rage in her eyes. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards a threat, pushing me faster, as icy fear clawed at my chest, a desperate, animalistic need to survive. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the cold night breeze a shock against my sweat-soaked skin. By the time the police arrived, called by a terrified neighbor who'd heard the commotion, I was a trembling wreck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial my phone, my fingers fumbling with the numbers. My voice cracked and faltered as I tried to explain, the words coming out in disjointed fragments laced with raw panic and profound regret. I rambled about blood, about her unnatural strength, about how she wasn't herself. They looked at me with the familiar blend of pity and professional skepticism. But by then, harmony was gone. The apartment, when they swept it, was eerily clean. No hospital had treated her wounds. No one had seen her. The bloodied sheets, which I swore had been there moments before, were nowhere to be found. The shattered window, Evi, a friend from my previous life, one of the few I hadn't entirely alienated, sent me a screenshot. My blood ran cold. It was her, a dating profile. Harmony. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, but with a predatory glint I recognized, a hunger that radiated from the pixelated image. Her smile, stretched wide, promised a sweetness that was a lie. Her name was listed as Harmony, but whatever she had become, it wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something that hunted, something I had wounded, but not killed. Harmony is still out there, her face smiling on dating apps, a siren luring others into her shadowed world. I can only imagine her cold, predatory gaze fixing on new prey, her once warm laugh now a distant echo, distorted into something chilling, something that promises eternal darkness. The girl I once loved is gone, replaced by something I can't name, something that stalks the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I can't escape. And no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I'll always wonder, dread pooling in my chest like stagnant water. When will she come back for me? And will I, the weary wanderer, the haunted everyman, be ready? Character count 99946.